Where did the Fraud Hawk meme come from? I'm not a manga reader, but as far as I know, he hasn't done anything to deserve the fraud title, right? So it's funny that you say that, because the fact that he hasn't done anything is exactly where this title comes from. If you go to the One Piece subreddit and type in Mihawk fraud, you'll realize that this has been a shockingly common topic over the years, ever so many years, including ever so many threads with the exact same name. In my search, I got these two, one above the other, with the exact same title, Mihawk is a fraud, which were posted 5 years apart, and the only difference between them is that the user 6 years ago decided to use a full stop. Nice and grammatically correct. But there is quite a rich and compelling history behind this. Fraud Hawk, as you can see, is not a recent development, and this skepticism has been following Mihawk for pretty much the entire history of the series, and a lot of it has to do with feats. Because online One Piece fans are more obsessed with feats than Quentin Tarantino, as if you're involved in any kind of attempt to power scale, then characters are generally compared by the individual displays of power that they have conjured, aka their feats. And the big problem with Mihawk is that he just has so very few feats to show. At the time of this recording, he's defeated East Blue Zoro, and that's good work. So he's at least on par with the Sugar Glass Bottle that also defeated Zoro in the live action East Blue. And as for who else Mihawk has beaten, well, there were the two unnamed newcomer at Marineford, so that might be a step up from the bottle. And he did also briefly clash with Mr. Sir Crocodile, although that doesn't give the greatest impression considering that Crocodile was beaten by pre-Haki, pre-Gear, pre-time skipper Luffy. However, what came after them was commander of the Whitebeard Pirates, Avista. They fought pretty equally for about a panel before Mihawk suggested postponing the duel, because apparently the very moment that someone can stand up to Mihawk, he needs to find a way out of the situation. And I want to make this clear, in the anime, Mihawk and Vista, they fight for quite an extended period of filler, but in the manga, it is instant. Vista, he jumps into the fight, and then Mihawk immediately suggests postponing it. In context, yes, Vista had greater concerns and this was beneficial to him, but Mihawk, he didn't really have any other concerns. There was nothing at the Paramount War that was really bothering him personally, and the one thing that he allegedly loves to do in this world is to face a strong swordsman, and when given the opportunity to do just that, he wiggled his way out like a well-lubed otter. So we will never know who was stronger, Mihawk or Vista. And what also doesn't help is that the prototype character who inspired Mihawk was Cyrano from Oda's One-Shot Monsters, who was a legitimate fraud, especially when compared to Ryuma, and Mihawk's poor feats really don't stand up to any of history's greatest swordsmen, like say one Kozuki Oden, who almost beat Kaido one-on-one. And Kaido is a surprisingly important and kinda funny factor in this discussion, as it's actually one of his quotes that provides the most damning evidence against Mihawk in this trial. This comes to us courtesy of chapter 1001, where Kaido examines Luffy and states, "What happened after I destroyed him in Kuri? There are only a scant few capable of fighting me. How high will your ceiling go?" And in this moment, Kaido does his best impression of a mid-2010s YouTuber and constructs his own top 5 list featuring the strongest characters in One Piece minus him. And on that list, we have former Pirate King Goldie Roger, former Whitebeard Edward Newgate, former Rocksteady Zebek, Kozuki Oden, Figurland Shanks, and Dracule not there. Mihawk is nowhere to be seen in Kaido's top 5. And I think it makes sense that Kaido's never fought Mihawk, because Mihawk, what interest would he have in that? Kaido is a clubman, not a swordsman. But it's still some pretty harsh feedback that Kaido doesn't even consider Mihawk to be capable of fighting him, because everyone remembers the iconic "How high will your ceiling go" quote. But what goes a bit unnoticed is Kaido's prior line, "There are only a scant few capable of fighting me." And Mihawk, according to Kaido, isn't one of them, which is slightly awkward because Shanks is, and he's arguably a swordsman, and we even have an undeniable swordsman in the mix being Kozuki Oden. And if you wanted to get weirdly technical, then Goldie Roger was also a swordsman, as was Rocksteady Zebek from what we know about him so far. And Whitebeard, well, he used a blade, but we won't count that. But even then, in Kaido's top 5, at least 4 of them appear to be swordsmen. And Kaido has just judged that Mihawk ain't on their level. However, another way to thoroughly judge a swordsman is through the black blade method. The most powerful swordsmen are the ones that have managed to create a black blade of their own, which Ryuma did with Shusui, as did Mihawk with Yoru. And so every time a new swordsman shows up in One Piece, you will often see this meme of Mihawk saying, "No black blade," judging the new swordsman for their evident lack of skill and worth as a sharp metalman. But the thing is, aside from this black blade business, business, almost every swordsman in One Piece has shown more of those sweet, sweet feats than Mihawk has, which has led to a bit of an expose on how Mihawk achieved his black blade, a process in 4 parts. Step 1. Purchase black paint at your local art supply or hardware store. Step 2. Apply paint to sharp metal of your choosing. Step 3. Perform 40 sets of sword drying activity in front of a fan. And finally, step 4. You are now ready to pretend to be the world's strongest swordsman. And this was the birth of the iconic Fraud Hawk. And you can always spot one in the wild because they'll be carrying a half-painted sword, a paint tin, and a paintbrush. And one of the most hilarious parts about this whole fake black blade business is that this concept did eventually become somewhat canon. In chapter 1111, in his fight against the Old Men, Gear 5th Luffy chewed a tree into a baseball bat, then took a paintbrush and a black can of paint and turned his bat into a black bat. The implication potentially being that this was Luffy's incredibly comical method of applying armament haki in this form, but it is so shockingly similar to the Fraudhawk meme that you have to wonder if Oda has seen it. And I think that is very possible. If only because One Piece live-action Mihawk actor Stephen John Ward did for quite some time use the iconic Fraudhawk sword painting image as his profile picture on Twitter. And one of the reasons why this meme has taken off so phenomenally is because Mihawk, he is constantly offered opportunities to disprove it, but he politely declines each and every time. We've already explored the whole Vista situation, but after the Warlord system was dissolved, a man who I will remind you all once held the epithet of Marine Hunter ran away as soon as the Marines started chasing him a little bit, and he went on to become the subordinate of a literal clown instead. And when said clown suggested that they go after the One Piece, Mihawk expressed great hesitance at fighting Shanks, Blackbeard, and even Luffy. Alright, so there is an artist on Twitter who I absolutely love named Togashi, and he has this unparalleled talent to distill and refine feelings imbued in panels like this. And in response to this chapter, Togashi made the following work where a proud Buggy is exclaiming, "Let's go claim the One Piece," whilst Mihawk is next to him going, do we have to fight the other Yonko?" with his trademark sword, paintbrush, and black paint tin sitting behind him. So one of the reasons why I love this meme so much is because it reverses the roles. Buggy, he is traditionally the fraud, but here, and in the actual series I should say, he is the one being completely genuine about his desires and ambition. And then you've got allegedly one of the most powerful people in the world kind of pissing himself in the corner. I don't want to do any of the fighting. And considering that Marine Admiral Kizaru offered to go to Wano all on his own and deal with Big Mom and Kaido at the same time, this sort of hesitance is not a good look from the world's strongest swordsman, resulting in a series of memes of Mihawk in tears and claiming, "I still have the East Blue," which to date is still Mihawk's greatest performance in the series. But in retrospect, was it really all that great? Let's take famed East Blue bunglenut Don Krieg. He has some rather fascinating reactions during the Baratie arc. For example, when he realizes who Zeff is, Don Krieg soils himself a little, and he is petrified to learn that he is dealing with the Red Leg Zeff. However, when Don Krieg interacts with Mihawk, an also famous man, arguably much more famous, Krieg arrogantly assumes that he can defeat Mihawk. There is a distinct imbalance of respect, and maybe you can put that down to Don Krieg being a poor judge of character, if you could believe that. Or perhaps the truth is that Zeff is just plain stronger. And also, in retrospect, Mihawk's fight against Zoro is a little bit suspicious. At the end of the fight, Baratie, Zoro uses his three-sword style secret technique, 3000 Worlds, and mate, as he is doing it, just look at this close-up of Mihawk and tell me that this isn't the most worried that Mihawk has ever looked in the entire series. He's all wide-eyed, and he's even got a sweat drop leaking down his face, which is the exact same style of sweat that Don Krieg had drizzling down his face when he realized that he was dealing with Zeff. Sweat that was not present in Krieg's interaction with Mihawk, mind you. And look, we've seen Mihawk go up against a lot of people. Vista, Whitebeard, and that's pretty much it. But in both of those cases, Mihawk was perfectly calm and collected. And yet, against East Blue Zoro, this dude is panicking. And let's be clear here, it's not because he thinks he may lose to Zoro. No. It's because after having committed to using Yoru to finish Zoro, Mihawk is worried that this secret technique might scratch some of the black paint off and reveal him for the fraud that he is and call his title into question. Although I will say that the title itself has always somewhat been in question. Depending on the translation you read or watch, Mihawk is either referred to as the world's strongest swordsman or the world's greatest swordsman. And the distinction between them is extremely important in regards to the Fraud Hawk narrative. And the original Japanese title is Sekkai Saikyo no Kenshi, which is pretty unambiguously world's strongest swordsman, strong indicating strength rather than skill, whereas world's greatest swordsman would leave a bit more room to move. But it is not that. And what's extremely interesting about this topic is that Eiichiro Oda himself has been pivoting away from the world's strongest swordsman over time. In chapter 1058, we discovered Mihawk's post-Warlord bounty, quite the chunksome sum. However, this was accompanied by the statement, Hawkeye's Mihawk, former warlord of the sea, with greater sword skill than even Red Hair the Emperor. And this is quite fascinating because Oda is so incredibly careful not to say that Mihawk is stronger than Shanks, but he is more skilled with a sword, whatever that means. And look, sometimes when lines like this appear, the online fanbase quite generously performs a free translation service, and in this case, the translation of this line ends up being, former warlord Hawkeye Mihawk has even greater sword skills, but not strength than the red-haired emperor, who is not actually a swordsman. I'm just bringing him up for fun. He's worth 3,590,000,000 berries, a fitting total for the world's skillest swordsman. Because it is very hard to call Mihawk the world's strongest swordsman, as the mere fact that one Shanks exists, kind of two actually, two Shanks kind of exist, but even one of them being out there proves that there is at least one stronger swordsman out there. But I guess that's only if Shanks uses his full Shanksome power and not just stick to the rules of traditional swordplay. And I do get this to some degree. Swordplay, it is an art form in and of itself, and let's take something like chess, for example. It wouldn't be linguistically out of the question to call Magnus Carlsen the strongest chess player of all time, with the distinction being that, with that strongest title, I still wouldn't expect him to do particularly well in an MMA league. And that's where we have a big grey area for Mihawk, where strength as a swordsman seems to be getting conflated with strength as a general combatant. And hey, it is possible that he's both. In fact, in a Reddit thread about this very topic, the distinction between strength and skill, one user very eloquently sums up the difference as, no point in having a big dick if all you're gonna do is thrust. So I hope that clears things up. It's just very difficult to tell how large Mihawk's throbbing skill is and how that compares to strength in general, because Mihawk refuses to fight anyone outside of his strict area of specialty, and given what we saw with Vista, even people within that area. And this goes on to be displayed right here in an accurately generated simulation of what would happen if Mihawk fought Shanks today. Mihawk would say, okay, just before we begin, I just want to remind you that this is a skill duel and not a strength duel. And for the love of God, please remember to turn off your conqueror's haki, which is another thing that people point towards in the Fraud Hawk discussion. The fact that we are almost 1,200 chapters into One Piece, and we still have no idea if Mihawk even has conqueror's haki. Fictionally, realistically, I think it's extremely likely that he does, but the fact that he hasn't shown it yet contributes to Mihawk's lack of feats. I don't even know how he walks around with all of these no feats. And considering that Zoro has conqueror's haki, Zoro, not that he knew about it, and the reason why he did not knew about it is because Mihawk didn't even teach him during the 2-year time skip. Also, not a good look for Mihawk, perhaps indicating that Mihawk does not have the expertise to teach conqueror's haki due to his lack of it. Because is it really necessary in a contest of sword skill anyway? And that is where we land at what I think is the most accurate and best possible title for Mihawk, which is Dracule Mihawk, the world's most skilled but not physically more powerful than Shanks swordsman. But again, not that I quite understand what separates Shanks' fighting style from a, what do we call it? Let's call it a pure swordsman. Shanks is confirmed to not be a devil fruit user, and he only has one arm. So it's not like he could play dirty and engage in some sort of punching even if he wanted to, because he needs that one arm to hold his one sword. So what's the difference then? Why is Shanks kind of disqualified aside from this? Is it Haki? I don't know. Mihawk uses Haki as well, observation and armament. Is it conquerors? Is it just the conquerors? Probably not, because I imagine Mihawk has that as well. So what is it that Shanks is doing in battle that stops him from being classified as a swordsman? And if it's nothing, does Mihawk really deserve his title, considering that it is he who refuses to fight Shanks and not the other way around? And if he's not going to fight against Shanks, then mate, you'd best believe there's going to be any number of excuses for not dueling any other top swordsman in One Piece either. Fujitora, for example, is an extremely skilled swordsman. However, would Mihawk even accept his challenge? Or would he refuse on the grounds of Fujitora being a devil fruit user? Well, we actually know the answer to this, as we have a scientifically generated rendering of what would happen if Mihawk were to fight Fujitora. After being brutally beaten, Shanks would need to interrupt the fight by yelling, "Stop, Admiral! Use your sword skills only, not a devil fruit." And I imagine that the same thing would apply to Green Bull, who is also a swordsman. However, he's a tree. And I'm sure that Mihawk would state that he only fights swordsmen, whereas Green Bull is more like a sword flora. But we have the same problem with almost every other swordsman in the series. You'd think that Figgle and Shamrock would be a great choice, right? Just like Shanks, but with two arms. Perfect. Well, no, not perfect, because his sword is a Kerberos, and that is cheating. That's not skill, that's fruit. And we have a similar issue with Ethan Baron Venus Jiro, who has the powers of a yokai, and after becoming an Elder Star, I think that Figgle and Garling is off the menu, boys, because he's no longer a pure swordsman after accepting Emu's pact. And I see there's a little bit of a problem here, because between Shamrock, Garling, and Ethan, you have three of the objectively best swordsmen in the world, none of which Mihawk would even recognize because they do not fit his criteria. And in the end, it's very easy to be the world's best at anything if the criteria forbids literally anyone except for you to compete in it. And just on that note, we should say that aside from Zoro, nobody in the One Piece world actually seems to care about the world's strongest swordsman title anyway. I've mentioned Garling, Shamrock, and Ethan, but they wouldn't even care to take up the challenge even if they were eligible. Not even Vista seemed all that interested in taking the title, because everyone else in this world has something actually productive it is that they want to do with their lives. In the case of Zoro, he wouldn't even be half as driven to beat Mihawk if it wasn't for the sake of fulfilling Kuina's dream. Very much proving the iconic meme, you can't lose your title if nobody cares about it. Although, as it turns out, that may or may not actually be true. In chapter 925, the interval between Act 1 and 2 of Wano, Mihawk made his first appearance outside of a cover story in post-time skip One Piece, where he was introduced as the world's strongest swordsman, Warlord of the Sea, Dracul Mihawk. And there is absolutely nothing unusual about that. However, things get a bit weird from here on. Mihawk's next appearance came with chapter 956, which takes place after the warlord system has been dissolved at the Reverie, and he is introduced as former warlord Dracul Mihawk, which is very interesting. Notice what's not there, because I knew that Mihawk got his warlord title stripped, but apparently so did the world's strongest swordsman title. That's stripped as well, because it ain't there anymore. But look, let's go easy on Storysmith Echiro Oda. Mistakes get made all the time, so let's just look onwards to Mihawk's next appearance, which is chapter 1058, and oh no, it's happened again. He's just introduced as former warlord of the sea, Dracul Mihawk. No world's strongest swordsman to be seen. And look, when even the author of the series stops acknowledging the title of the character he created, well, that is when your phone rings and the incoming call is flagged as a potential fraud. Usopp is a Tontatta, and not just that, but also another thing that far too many people have missed. So you let me, man on the internet, explain. In chapter 1139, the missionary of love, Scopogaban, stated, "There are many mixed blood races throughout history. The Buccaneers, the Dosendata, the Long Arms and Long Legs, and the Wotans. These blended peoples don't tend to last long, but in every era there have always been those who are more open-minded." And this was the first time that we'd heard this particular race, the Dosendata, said. But it would not be the last, as the question then needed to be asked, well, what exactly are they? A question which was asked in the SBS of volume 112. Question: hello, Oda-san. What are the Dosendata tribe? Are they a tribe of mixed race between giants and dwarves? Answer: quite close. The correct answer is a mixed race between humans and dwarves. The name of the dwarves tribe, Tontatta, Tontatta came from the cute sounds of their footsteps. If you raise that sound volume a bit more, it becomes a Dosundatta, and the mixed race between a giant and a dwarf is the Zushin Dodo tribe. They're very rare. So it was not giants and dwarves, it was in fact dwarves and humans. They are the Dosundatta. And after discovering this information, the eyes of many men on the internet started to scour the series for any potential Dosundatta sightings. And they didn't get very far, because in chapter 41 we see a flashback of Usopp's mother Banchina, whose nose looks suspiciously exactly the same as the noses of the vast majority, but not all of the Tontatta tribe introduced on Dressrosa. Banchina's nose is even quite different to Usopp's. He's more of a, a long cylinder. That's 2 cylinders, that's a lot of nose. But Banchina has that, more triangular pointy nose. And after creating well over 1,000 named characters, this sort of nose is actually very specific. In fact, long noses in general are very unusual in One Piece. Aside from Usopp, Banchina, and the Tontatta tribe, the only long nose I can think of off the top of my head is Kaku, and Katarina Devon, and Vasco Shot, and Charlotte Perospero, and Arlong, and Foxy, and Charles Brule, and Soga King, and Higurashi, and Nisei Usopp, fake fisherman impersonating Usopp in that one game I've forgotten the name of. And lots, let's just say lots. Okay, so long noses aren't anywhere near as rare as I initially thought they were, and yet I haven't even mentioned the big one yet. The big one being Mr. Blackbeard. Oftentimes, what we focus on are Blackbeard's inconsistent teeth, but what we should be focusing on is his wildly inconsistent nose. Pre-time skip, Blackbeard usually, but not always, has a wide, chonksome nose, but post-time skip, his nose has gotten significantly thinner and longer, to the point where he could have a noses-only sword fight with Usopp. So here's the reason why Blackbeard has a long nose, because he's a bad man, and evil characters tend to be given what are considered to be ugly features, like your classic long-nosed witch. That also happens to be why Katarina Devon, Vasco Shot, Perospero, Arlong, Foxy, Kaku, and Brule were given long noses, because they all started their tenure in One Piece as villains and most remain as villains. But look, I'm a lot less interested in all of them because I understand the thematic nature behind those choices. However, what I am very interested in are good characters who are given this feature by Oda, because there is a certain connective tissue that these other characters don't have. All of the people I mentioned just then, what I will say for all of their noses is that they're all their own unique kind of aberrations of nature. They don't follow a uniform schnoz. However, there are characters in One Piece who I immediately thought of when I re-examined the Tontatta style nose, and they would be Mozu and Kiwi of the Frankie family. If you need help telling them apart, Mozu is the one dressed like a kiwi fruit, and Kiwi is the one not dressed like a kiwi fruit. In any case, they have the Banchina nose, also known as the Tontatta nose, and so my proposal would be that Mozu, Kiwi, Banchina, and by genetic association Usopp, may be descendants of the Tontatta tribe. They could be Dosundattas, the mix between humans and dwarves. And with that in mind, Usopp's role on Dressrosa becomes a lot more interesting to examine. The Tontatta tribe have a curious amount in common with Usopp, but in many ways they're also the total opposite of him, particularly when it comes to communication, with Usopp being a prolific liar, whilst the Tontatta go so far as to redefine the word gullible in the fictional pirate dictionary, which makes these two parties a pretty perfect match, because no matter what Usopp says, the Tontatta will believe it without question. For example, when Leo was interrogating Robin in chapter 711, he was adamant that she was lying for about half a second until Robin said, "It's true," and Leo immediately switched his views and made friends with her, because why would anyone lie? And even Robin was shocked at how gullible all the Tontatta were, making this a phenomenal Robin face in the process. Plus, there's also a pretty fantastic part where Leo gets captured by Treble and interrogated about his other allies. And after initially refusing to give Treble any names, Treble says, "But he's my friend." What's his name again? And Leo then smiles and names Usopp, or I guess Usoland, thus giving away his friend, because Treble said his friend was his friend, and why would anyone lie? So not only are they gullible, but the Tontatta tribe are probably completely incapable of lying. They are honest to a fault. Again, the opposite of Usopp, and we'll get more into this in a bit. But Usopp's lesson on Dressrosa is less one about bravery and more one of honesty. Usopp's lies began as a defense mechanism, and to this very day he lies and acts all tough in order to conceal his crippling fear, which isn't all that dissimilar to the Tontatta tribe. The Tontatta do mostly rely on trickery to get by. They prefer to stay hidden and take advantage of their speed to deceive targets or opponents into believing that they're dealing with some sort of overwhelming supernatural force, which very much reminds me of Usopp lying about his 8,000 loyal men to project that same sort of power. The difference, I suppose, is that the Tontatta tribe practice a more honest deception, if that makes sense, because the whole reason why they did this right is because the Tontatta tribe made a deal with the Riku dynasty to pretend to be fairies, and with that status they can acquire, aka steal, any resources they need from Dressrosa. Lying isn't always a bad thing, and in the case of the Tontatta, it is a mutually agreed upon lie that sustained their civilization for 800 years. Whilst the Tontatta, like Usopp, do act tough, but they're quite emotionally weak. They will laugh, cry, get scared, get anything. They will feel absolutely all of the things at the slightest hint of a mood shift or even a false suggestion. Their entire society is quite childish as well. I mean, I don't know, childish might be the wrong word, but they do all have this childlike innocence, and actually, you know, they do all talk like this. Whatever that is. But they remind me so much of Usopp pretending to be a pirate when he was a child on Syrup Village. In fact, before Operation SOP, Leo even gets a packed lunch from his mother, which was very sweet of her. And in further connection to Usopp, the Tontatta tribe also have an affinity for insects, with a legion of rhinoceros beetles and hornets for transport at the Tontatta airport, which Usopp goes crazy for because he loves insects, as does Luffy. And not only that, but Usopp's connection goes a bit deeper because he was trained by Heracles, a man perpetually dressed as a beetle. These small connections are not an accident. Even more so than the giants of Elbaf, who Usopp admires above all others, the Tontatta tribe almost feels like it was designed for Usopp. And so it's very fitting that he goes on to become one of their legendary heroes, as one of the many lies that Usopp tells the tribe is that he is a descendant of their hero Mont Blanc Noland. And I love how Leo mentally pictures Noland. He's the great big person botanist who came to our kingdom 400 years ago. Some bad guys were messing up our island, but he came to the ancestors' side and helped us win the battle. He's a legendary hero to all Tontattas. And as part of this, Leo is shown thinking of Noland as a very stereotypical superhero, much like how Usopp portrays himself in the guise of Soccer King. And not to go too far on this tangent, but one of the other more popular theories about Usopp is that he is the descendant of Noland, just with the inverse effect of Noland, who told the truth but became known as a historical liar, and Usopp, who is a generational talent at lying, somehow mostly being known as a man who always tells the truth because those lies just fatefully happen to come true. But there's another connection that people don't usually immediately notice, which is that Noland was a botanist, and during the time skip, Usopp primarily studied botany, and now most of his skill set is botany based. And also an even smaller reference to Noland can be found in chapter 740. When Usopp runs away from Treble, he apologizes to the Tontatta tribe and goes on to state, "Oh, I know, I'll write a picture book of your tale for future generations. The Honest Little Tontattas," which is a play on the Lion Noland picture book, which was written about him. And again, Usopp emphasizes the honesty of the Tontattas by juxtaposing it against Noland's honesty. And while these little people had a very little role in a rather bigsome arc, they were originally supposed to be a far larger deal in general. The Tontatta were originally supposed to have their own entire arc, as Green Bit was going to be a story of its own between Punk Hazard and Dressrosa, which is why at the end of Punk Hazard, Trafalgar Law tells Smoker that they're headed to Green Bit instead of just saying Dressrosa, which is the island that hosts Green Bit. However, Oda's editors convinced him to truncate and combine his arc ideas, and that's something that's happened fairly frequently post-time skip. Punk Hazard itself was a result of Oda wanting to do an arc on a fire island and then an ice island, and so they became one. And this next one has never officially been confirmed, but this is my personal speculation, right? I reckon that Whole Cake Island is also a combination of two arc ideas, one for Totterland and Big Mom, and the other for the Germa Kingdom. But the reason why I find this relevant is because Oda initially envisioned that the Tontatta were a race notable enough to have an entire arc constructed around them, just like the Fishmen and just like the Giants. And it should also be noted that the Tontatta conflict historically did not begin with Doflamingo. What Usopp stumbled into was the result of over 900 years of history coming to fruition. Apparently, in the long past, the Tontatta tribe left their home in search of new resources, and actually, I just want to briefly pause on that, because that happens to be the exact same reason why the Moonanites had to leave the moon city of Burka and founded the three sky civilizations on the planet Blue Star. Now, I'm not suggesting that the Tontatta tribe are aliens as well, but I do think it's very interesting that they have the exact same backstory around the exact same time as the Sky People. However, the ancient Tontatta tribe encountered Doflamingo Doflamingo's ancestor Don Quixote, some guy who promised the Tontatta land, resources, and safety in exchange for their labor, which turned out to be lies. Well, all lies except for the labor part. There was lots of labor. That promise was well met, as the Tontatta tribe were enslaved until after the Void Century, when the Don Quixote monarchy promptly abandoned Dressrosa and went to live at the Holy Land of Marijois, after which point the Riku dynasty took over, abolishing slavery and even enacted reparations, which is why the Tontatta tribe can just go and ferry whatever it is they need. However, I would say the biggest difference between the Tontatta tribe and Usopp is that the Tontatta, unlike Usopp, are extremely brave. This is likely in part due to their naivety. They don't quite understand the scale of the danger that they're getting themselves into. But of everyone who launches an attack on Treble and Sugar, Usopp was the only one to run away. And I think that during Dressrosa, it says a lot that these tiny fairy people possess the bravery that Usopp has spent this entire series trying to acquire. And despite the fact that you quite literally need to look down upon them, Usopp found another group of people to look up to. A group of people who, yes, are very small, but extremely powerful for their size. Nobody expects much of them because of how they look and how they sound and how they act and how they everything, but they are capable of packing a serious punch, just like Usopp. And so the main mission of our honest little Tontatta tribe is to rid Dressrosa of its lies. Doflamingo lied to the population about King Riku's actions 10 years ago, and Sugar's powers have caused the island to be continuously gaslit via magical fruit. However, what the Tontatta tribe unwittingly do is place their faith in a liar to dispel these lies, which Usopp does. But in the process, he has to shed his own lies, coming clean about the fact that he is no Usoland, but also adding that, my name is Usopp. Remember that, Tontattas? And if I should die, build me a statue next to Noland's, because I'm about to become your legendary hero. Usopp tells a lot of lies, especially on Dressrosa, but the biggest lie of all, and look, this is going to sound corny as crap, but the biggest lie of all is his lack of belief in himself. Everyone believes in Usopp except for Usopp himself. After being turned into a toy, Robin is just waiting for Usopp to save her, and as he lay beaten in front of the House of Toys, Frankie is just waiting for Usopp to succeed and start the agreed upon panic that'll save him. Because the truth is that Usopp is a very reliable man, and he did manage to defeat Sugar using the greatest feature of the Tontatta tribe being their unbridled honesty. Sugar knew what the weapon was. Sugar knew who Usopp was. There were no lies. There was no deception happening here, and honesty ended up winning the day. And stupidity. Sugar should not have fed the thing to Usopp. But mostly honesty. And I also want to note that in his defeat of Sugar, Usopp also becomes a hero of the giants at the same time, as a restored Harudin then raises him into the air and says, "Look closely, warriors. Gaze upon the face of the man who has undone our curse, our hero, and his name is Captain Usopp." And so it's as if Usopp, using the Tontatta philosophy of honesty, allowed him to get a massive step closer to his goal of achieving the bravery of a giant. All by embracing what the point of this video is claiming is his potential Tontatta heritage. And if this did turn out to be true, then I think it would be pretty amazing to look back on Dressrosa as Usopp, a legit Tontatta hero coming back to help his ancestral tribe. However, as always, there is a however, which is that we do actually have one confirmed Dosendata in the series, and that would be Charlotte Normand, the result of Big Mom having very precise and surgical intercourse with a Tontatta. And Normand is interesting because on Dressrosa, the Tontatta tribe were constantly referred to as fairies, and Normand, a Dosendata, does actually dress like a fairy. At least I think she dresses like a fairy. I doubt the wings are real. However, we may have a problem here though, because Charlotte Normand is absolutely teeny tiny despite being half human. And when I say half human, I'm kind of, but not really, because remember that her human half is a Charlotte Lin Lin, who isn't exactly your average sized human. She's a colossal, practically a small giant. And so Charlotte Normand's size, even though she's only 10 years old and will likely grow, is still concerning for this theory. Because if Usopp was a Tontatta descendant and his mother Banchina, then surely they would be much smaller. At the moment, Normand fits in the palm of another child's hand, not even an adult's hand, another child's hand. So for Banchina and Usopp to have this Tontatta lineage, it would need to be quite a few generations back and a very strong human mix. However, there is another very sneaky option question that Eiichiro Oda dropped right in front of us, clumsy Oda, as he also specifically named the Zushin Dodo race, the mix of giants and dwarves. One of the rarest races in the One Piece world, and just let me put this out there, what if Usopp was the descendant of not only the Tontatta, also the giants? Usopp could be a Zushin Dodo, which explains both the nose and the human sizing of his mother, and I guess Usopp himself. Because as much as we like to think of One Piece as a story about a bunch of nobody kids who came from nothing setting sail to accomplish crazy dreams, the Straw Hats as a whole tend to be subject to some incredibly fatesome nepotism. Luffy goes without saying, but if Zoro can end up being the descendant of Ryuma, the legendary samurai of Wano, then I don't see why Usopp can't also have some hidden heritage and historical baggage to bring with him into the final war. At the very least, Usopp is very much spiritually a Zushin Dodo. He's been identified by Oda as the weakest member of the Straw Hats, and Oda has stated that he always will be, but he wants to be a brave warrior of the sea and embody the ideals of the giants. So he's got the spirit of a giant in the narratively tiniest body. And while an argument could be made that this would ruin Usopp's role as the distinctly human perspective with nothing really special going on, just sheer will and wit, I think you could also counter that with the Luffy argument, which is that this boy is blessed by fate. But Luffy doesn't know, nor does he care. And even with all of the history behind his existence, Luffy still goes out there and owns each and everything he achieves. And if that can be true of Luffy, then the same can be true of Usopp as well. Especially if, just like Luffy and Zoro, he never finds out. And whilst Usopp already has a statue dedicated to him on Dressrosa, the question now becomes, will this man eventually have a statue dedicated to him on Elbaf as well, fulfilling his legacy of becoming a legendary hero of both races? The Revolutionary Army will fail, because whether they realize it or not, they're on the exact same path that the world government paved during the Void Century, as 20 kingdoms gallantly rose up to overthrow the tyranny of the ancient kingdom, and the revolutionary cycle is destined to repeat itself unless the efforts of one rubber boy can change everything, which they very well may. But the first thing that makes me rather nervous about the current state of the Revolutionary Army is something that I've brought up briefly in other videos but never properly expanded on, and that is the cult status of Sabo as the Flame Emperor, which at this stage represents the driving force of the revolution. As following the 8 Nation Revolution, Sabo is described as being worshipped as something akin to a deity, and it's not hard to see why, because the revolutionists see Sabo in the same way that many other nations see Luffy, as a liberator. It's because of Sabo's actions that they were able to escape tyranny and free themselves, with the main difference being that the nations liberated by Luffy have personal experience with him. They know his personality, they know his nature, and that nature ends up imprinting on the countries he saves and puts them onto a better path. However, Sabo was not present in any of the nations that revolted. They do not know his nature, and in fact, almost everything they think they know about Sabo is a lie. The world government blames Sabo for killing King Cobra, abducting Princess Vivi, and trying to kill St. Charlos, and that violent nature is what's being imprinted onto the nations that now worship Sabo, believing this to be his nature, his choices, his actions, and emulating that is their path forward to further liberation. It's actually a very odd case where the people are using world government propaganda in order to free themselves from world government propaganda. And it's not a situation that Sabo is entirely against. As he famously says, anything that gets the flames of revolution burning, which is a quote that we'll return to shortly. But with a series of countries who believe that killing, kidnapping, and other assorted tactics are the way forward, are we not now just in the process of creating a new world government? Because that is exactly how the current world government formed. They were a group of nations who, justifiably or not, felt oppressed by the ancient kingdom. So they joined forces in a global revolt during the Void Century and overthrew said nation, with the leaders then going on to be worshipped as the gods that evolved into the celestial dragons, which again we have seen the inception of here with Sabo Sabo being worshipped like a god, the first of his kind, but probably not the last. If the revolution continues in this vein, then Sabo is just going to be the first of many of a new generation of world nobles, which is the exact problem that we're trying so hard to eradicate. And here's a bit of a hypothetical. Sabo's followers currently believe that kill-murdering royalty is the path forward. So what would happen if any of these nations were to encounter, say, Princess Vivi? Would they follow the example they believe that Sabo set and try to kill Vivi for the greater good? She is a Nefertari after all, one of the 20 founding families who shaped the world into what it is today. This is another reason why I think the Revolutionary Army could fail, because I don't accept that we're going to create a world where this is the mentality that persists. All it does is result in another different but kind of the same world government being created. Although a counter argument to this would be that Sabo, the face of the revolution, would never let that happen and that he's an X factor here, but I'm not so convinced about that, as Sabo has already shown signs of moral compromise when he stated anything that gets the flames of revolution burning. Anything, and that right there is another key difference between Luffy and Sabo, because Luffy has been in very similar situations before and probably will be again. Luffy has impacted so many kingdoms and been called so many different things, but Luffy always rejects a false narrative that people try to force on him. At all times, even if it's not in his best interests, Luffy aggressively and bluntly maintains his freedom and individuality, but Sabo does not. And he currently appears to be content with becoming anything that people need and or want him to be. And anything, mate, that word, anything, is a lot of things. And not all of those things are good. Probably most of them are bad. And what if a time were to come where that anything involves Sabo crossing that moral line? Not just having other people's crimes retroactively assigned to him by the world government, but committing your own crimes. After having seen Emu and the literal demons that rule this world, is any act really off the table for Sabo in order to defeat them, including crossing that moral line and becoming something of a demon himself? And if the answer to that question is no, then can Sabo really be trusted with his newfound power and influence? When there's real stakes, sweet, juicy stakes on the line, people can make surprising decisions, to say the least. And I know that this channel, it's about fictional pirates, but just bear with me for a second here. This is all going to come together, because there is an extremely relevant episode of Star Trek Deep Space Nine called In the Pale Moonlight that deals with a very similar scenario. In this episode, Captain Sisko somewhat intentionally becomes an accessory to murder in the assassination of a Romulan diplomat, an assassination that is then blamed on Sisko's enemy, the Dominion, which causes the Romulans to declare war on the Dominion, greatly assisting Sisko and the Federation, and arguably saving the very existence of the Federation, because their war against the Dominion was not going well, not well at all. And at the end of the episode, Sisko reckons with the idea that he's just taken part in the killing of an innocent man for the greater good, and he then rather iconically says, "I can live with it," before erasing all evidence of his involvement. Bit of a tangent there, but this episode does such a great job of portraying desperation in wartime, as well as the surprising elasticity of morality of even the best of us under very real pressure, which is exactly where Sabo and the Revolutionary Army as a whole currently sit. They are fighting at an overwhelming disadvantage. They cannot win a straightforward head-on fight, which leaves them in a very desperate position and needing to become a quite, how shall we say, creative with tactics. And I would argue that some of their creative current tactics are already dangerously close to crossing that moral boundary. I'll get back to Sabo in a bit because his decision is going to be the key factor here. But right now, we need to talk about Daddy Dragon. His plan to bring down the world nobles is nothing short of brilliant, but brilliant does not always mean good. Rather than face the world government head-on, Dragon has crafted a siege on the Holy Land of Marijois by destroying their food reserves and focusing the efforts of the direct army onto destroying and commandeering food supplies bound to the Holy Land. Dragon isn't choosing to engage with the actual military might of the world government because currently that is a fight he cannot win. And luckily for Dragon, there's enough chaos happening right now with the four emperors. We have Monkey D. Luffy doing things like the Egghead Incident, as well as the world government's desperate efforts to try and capture the former warlords of the sea that are tying up the bulk of marine forces. So there's no one to really stop Dragon carrying out his guerrilla tactics of focusing purely on food supply. And if this does continue, then no matter how powerful the world government is, the world nobles will eventually run out of food and they will starve. But my question here is, would that be an acceptable solution to our world noble problem? And I know that a lot of you are probably screaming at the screen, yes, internet man, yes it is, they're bad people and they deserve it. However, I would reply that everything else we've seen in One Piece would suggest that no, it is not an acceptable solution. Oda has a very profound philosophy on food and hunger within One Piece, which can be seen all throughout the series, and we can go all the way back to East Blue with Sanji feeding Gin and Zeff feeding Don Krieg, even though it meant healing his enemy and potentially forfeiting Baratie itself, which was Zeff and Sanji's entire world at the time. And I've been through this many times on the channel before, but Oda often links food directly to the morality of a character. You can tell everything you need to know about where a character stands by watching them eat. Luffy, for example, he is a voracious glutton, but he is always grateful for the food he receives. And he will bring down entire monarchies as thanks for being fed a single meal. And this goes to even the most basic of foods. Tama on Wano fed Luffy a small bowl of rice, but that became Luffy's primary driving force to defeat Kaido. All throughout the rest of the arc, Luffy's thoughts were of Tama starving, and he wanted to create a world where his friends could eat as much as they want. And I genuinely think that if you were to ask Luffy himself whether or not the world noble should starve, I think that he'd say no. And if he did meet a somewhat friendly world noble, and those do exist, then he may even fight for them to be able to eat. Because yes, Luffy knows firsthand how beyond horrible they can be, but Luffy is a very simple man and his take on food is universal. No, he's not going to share any of his food, he's no hero after all, but he's also never going to be actively in favor of mass starvation, no matter who it's being carried out against. And that's why I think the Dragon's plan could fail, because this is Oda's story, and while Dragon's plan is one solution to the problem, it's not necessarily the correct solution. Do we really want our good guys starving a whole society to death? Is our solution to genocide the genociders? Well, I think in this fictional pirate comic, the answer is probably not. Eiichiro Oda is just not that vindictive or nihilistic of an author, and it feels very inconsistent with the morality of Luffy, who is our guiding compass in the series. I'm not saying that Luffy's gonna step in and say, no father, stop this madness, what you're doing is wrong. Definitely not. And I do feel like Luffy himself is going to have very limited, if any, involvement with the revolutionary side of the endgame plot, just because Luffy's gonna be balls deep in cherry pie fighting Blackbeard on the pirate front. But Luffy is the man who's going to bring about the dawn of the world. We are following the path that he is carving out for us into whatever the next world looks like. And whatever that is, all I know is it's not gonna look like what Dragon's doing right now. Dragon is still playing by the rules of this current world, this horrible, horrible world. So I think this current plan is going to fail and we are going to land on a more humane solution, regardless of whether or not the world nobles deserve it. And in lieu of Luffy, the role to change the direction of this revolution is almost entirely in Sabo's hands, at least at the moment. And I don't know, I don't think that Sabo is ever going to cross that moral line personally. As much as he's edging it at the moment, he is Luffy's brother and someone who Oda probably wants to keep as clean as possible. However, the people worshipping him, that is a very different story. And a very relevant story because they are the revolution. They are the flame that has been lit. And while Sabo may not have killed Cobra, kidnapped Vivi, or attempted to kill St. Charles, these flames were created on the belief that Sabo was willing to commit these actions, which regardless of their truth, will be what the newfound revolutionaries all over the world will seek to emulate. Which at the moment is very much in line with Dragon's way of thinking, at least as far as we know. Dragon could be significantly softer hearted and a more moral man than we're currently aware of, but just judging by his strategy so far, he comes off as a more hardened man, willing to do anything that needs to be done, which could even push him into conflict with Sabo if they start disagreeing on exactly what the final solution to the world government is. Although something that needs to be said is that it's not the goal of the Revolutionary Army to destroy the world government. The world government tends to get conflated with the world nobles, which is understandable because the world nobles run the world government, but Koala has stated that the enemy of the Revolutionary Army is not the world government. It is the world nobles who control said government. So this isn't some colossal scale plan to completely destroy the system. It is a targeted approach to removing those who currently control the system, which is a very important nuance that those who worship the Flame Emperor may not necessarily be on board with. The world government as an entity does provide the single greatest source of stability in the world, at least currently. Without it, the whole planet would be governed by emperors and warlords and other assorted beings. And whilst the world government is widely seen as a symbol of tyranny, it does do quite an objective amount of good, which can be seen in the kings and queens that are members of the world government. We tend to think of it as an organization revolution exclusively made up of corruption, but that only describes some of them. You do have benevolent rulers such as King Cobra, King Riku, and even King Neptune, who wants Fishman Island to become a fully recognized world government nation as a bridge between fishmen and humans. There are over 170 allied nations within the world government, and not every king or queen that rules them is a corrupt prick. There's an awful lot of them who have found the system quite beneficial for stability and prosperity of their people, and getting rid of the world government could destroy everything for them. Although the most clear area to see this nuance is within the Marines. We've been introduced to an awful lot of Marines, and the vast majority of them are pretty decent people looking to protect the public and enact what they believe is justice. Many of them are even encouraged to find their own personal definition of justice. Whilst the Revolutionary Army have always been portrayed as something of an ominous force in opposition to the world government, even by those who don't just buy the world government propaganda, one thing that always sticks out to me is the first time the Straw Hats learned about the Revolutionary Army, which was in chapter 432, and the way that Oda decided to depict their mission was in this panel of two warring factions, an existing royal army and a revolutionary force of some vague kingdom, featuring a skull in the foreground with a sword jammed straight through it. At the time, this was Robin telling Luffy about the Revolutionary Army, so I suppose this is implied to be her mental image, which would have definitely changed after spending 2 whole years with them. But I find it very interesting that the way that Oda chooses to depict the Revolutionary Army has this consistent focus on violence and chaos. Not that they're necessarily the only ones propagating that, but the impression I get is more so that the world the Revolutionary Army operates in is one of such desperation that this outcome is preferable to living under the current conditions for many people of these many kingdoms. But one other thing that also gives me pause for thought is the unknown endgame of Dragon's plans. You know, it's a lovely idea to say, let's get rid of those world nobles, but once we do that, then who steps in to take charge of the system? And perhaps more importantly, how do you prevent this newly installed regime from rapidly developing into an institution every bit as corrupt as the world nobles? Well, let's take the most straightforward outcome of a successful global revolution, which would be that the leader of said revolution, Dragon, takes command. This is probably a very bad idea. Even if it's for the betterment of the world, Dragon is still widely believed to be one of the worst criminals to have ever lived, and a large amount of the planet would not be able to accept the world government being placed under his control or the control of his forces. But I believe that Dragon has accounted for this and likely has no intention of ever taking command of anything himself. As I've said in several of these revolutionary videos, the Revolutionary Army themselves are a very hands-off group. They rarely take direct and decisive action. And I personally believe that's because they do not want to be seen as leaders, because that could result in the people of the world becoming passive, believing that the Revolutionary Army is over there and they exist to solve their problems for them. And so the future of this revolution is pretty much entirely up to the residents of the islands. And the reason why I think is pretty perfectly articulated by Emporio Ivankov when during Impel Down he said to Bon Clay, "I won't waste my time saving fools who can't save themselves. Even with nations that were about to suffer economic collapse or be torn apart by wars, all I did was focus on their will to live. Miracles only happen to those who never give up. Never underestimate the power of miracles." And this quote sticks out to me a lot because it's more or less the same philosophy that Luffy has. Luffy won't ever help anyone just because it's the right thing to do. He will only help people who are willing to fight for themselves. And my go-to example of this is always Momonosuke. If he had not declared his desire to beat Kaido and his willingness to fight, then it's probable that Luffy does not help this child and doesn't get involved in Wano at all. Luffy has his own dreams and will to pursue, and he's not wasting time with people who have no willpower of their own. Because that's not freedom. That's Luffy becoming a glorified global police force. And that's one thing I do find very encouraging about the Revolutionary Army, that they are taking the Luffy approach on a more industrial and targeted scale. However, the problem with that is that the Revolutionary Army are not Luffy. Our future Pirate King has the ability to bring out the best in people, to inspire them to develop an unbreakable will, and the Revolutionary Army, they do a pretty decent job of this, but it's not quite the same. They're lacking that Luffy X factor. Bello Betty can inspire people to fight with a rousing speech, a fictional fruit in an open shirt, and Sabo can perform outrageous acts that spark flames across the planet, but the will they're conjuring is very different. It's a lot more fragile than what Luffy creates, and it's being channeled in directions that anyone inspired by Luffy would never dare pursue. And the Revolutionary Army itself is unlikely to step in and correct this this path for all of the reasons I've just stated. They exist to spark and support, not necessarily to lead. And so the key here is more than likely a combination between Dragon's methods and Luffy's inspiration. What Dragon is very effectively doing is giving the world the tools they need to act. And what Luffy is doing is giving the world not only the will to act, but also bestowing them with a particular brand of purity and joy that only a sun god could deliver. And ideally ensuring that the next world won't make the same mistake as the previous three. How do you feel about the fan theory that Treatima is Luffy's mum? Alright, so this is not a new idea. And in case you're unaware, Treatima was an Empress of Amazon Lily. She served between Shaki and Boa Hancock, and sadly passed away of love sickness 13 years ago, which was when Boa Hancock took over as Empress. And the thing that interests me most about Treatima is the man she fell for. Who was it? Because these Amazon Lily Empresses have pretty damn high standards. Standards set as far back as Gloriosa falling in love with the future Pirate King Goldie Roger, as well as Shaki marrying Dark King Silver's Rayleigh, and then Boa Hancock again falling for a future Pirate King in Monkey D. Luffy. So it has to be someone important. I mean, I guess it doesn't have to be, but you'd figure that if Treatima fell for just some dude, then everything might have worked out and she wouldn't be dead right now. But when the SBSO Volume 109 came out, which was where Oda revealed the name and design of Treatima for the first time, for that video, I used a thumbnail of Treatima holding a baby Luffy and Dragon walking away in the background, very much fanning the flames of this theory. And that's because whenever a new woman is introduced in One Piece, the immediate fanbase reaction is, could this be Luffy's mother? And if not, could it be someone else's mother? Whose mother is it? Especially if it's a woman of some prominence. And to be completely honest, despite being more than happy to have fun with the idea in thumbnails, I don't really buy into the whole Treatima Luffy connection. When chapter 1156 came out, I saw a lot of comparisons of Treatima's young face with Luffy, and I'm not immune from using aesthetic elements as a basis of relation theories, and I kind of see where people are coming from, but I do still think it's a pretty big stretch. Remembering that Treatima is quite young in this image, we're not exactly sure how young, but she is noticeably smaller and childer than both Shaki and Gloriosa. And Oda tends to draw almost all of his child characters with that more Luffy style of innocence in the facial features. So Treatima smiling a bit like Luffy here, that doesn't sell me on it on its own. But the bigger issue with this theory is something that I've brought up in other videos, but when we were introduced to Amazon Lily, it was stated that members of the Kuja tribe only give birth to girls. Although this is somewhat disputed because the official English translation does make it sound like Amazon Lily, the island, is the reason for this phenomena, as it states that only female children are born, quote, here, but the original Japanese just says that all children that the Kuja give birth to are female. So it removes the location from the equation. And I trust this information because this is the One Piece narrator speaking, and I can't think of a situation off the top of my head where the narrator has lied to us. And that's the simple part of the theory. It gets a lot more complex when you try to explain things like why Treatima gave Luffy up, because she would have passed away when Luffy was 6 years old, and to explain that, I guess Luffy being a boy means that he can't grow up on Amazon Lily, and maybe Treatima died of a less traditional love sickness due to missing her child, and that would admittedly be a very kind of Oda thing to write with his current parental focus. But until the whole monogender birth issue is resolved, I can't really seriously consider this, because you've got the narrator straight up telling us that this idea is wrong. I looked it up last night, and Dragon will be 17 at the time of the God Valley incident. I think we might see Dragon there as a young Marine. There's also a lot of other big Revolutionary Army characters there, probably where they met. I mean, there is Kuma and Ivankov. Don't know if they met Dragon there. But also, before we get into that, this is one more thing in favor of the Treatima idea, which is that she and Dragon were probably around the same age. So maybe if Treatima sighted a handsome dragonman and went, I want some of that, then that could be our Luffy mother. But I still think probably not. But I do hope that we see Dragon during this flashback, and very potentially being an enlisted Marine present during God Valley. This would be amazing, as I think it could have started his revolutionary ideas. After being employed as a glorified guard to prevent slaves from escaping during the native hunting competition, it would be very easy to see Dragon being radicalized after that. But I also think it would be interesting if Dragon was to witness Garp and Roger teaming up to protect the world nobles after after this disgusting behavior, because that would show Dragon that neither the Marines nor piracy is the path forward, and potentially inspire him to found his eventual third faction, the Freedom Fighters, which would go on to become the Revolutionary Army. Internet man, I have a question. Do you think that Kyo is an undercover Marine? I ask this because in the last chapter it was stated that the Marines mobilized, quote, too fast, and that got me thinking that there might be a traitor. Plus, with the face shape, Kyo reminds me of Zephyr from Film Z. Since we are getting Shiki from Strong World, it isn't impossible he too could be canon. I kind of wish this was true. Film Z is my favorite One Piece movie, and it would be so cool to see Zephyr incorporated into canon somehow. But I don't think that Silver Axe's design matches up very well with Zephyr's. Beyond the bulky frame and the short hair, those are quite similar. But when I look at their faces, their lips and noses are very distinctly different. But I do have to admit, I love the idea of a future Marine Admiral going undercover with the Rocks Pirates, because the Marines would have needed someone of that level of strength to be worthy of infiltrating them in the first place. And this is not at all an unheard of idea, as Diaz Drake did the exact same thing to infiltrate the Beast Pirates. He had to spend years building a career as a notorious dinosaur and be powerful enough to earn his spot in the Toby Roppo. But I'm also pretty sure that Silver Axe is a Devil Fruit user, because he has that Mad Monk Rouge style transformation when we first met him. He went from being super scrawny to big, bulky man after being kicked. And Zephyr was not a Devil Fruit user. In fact, Zephyr was very critical of characters who relied too much on their fruit abilities. And there's a great moment in Film Z where Zephyr actually chastises Kizaru for leaning too heavily on fictional fruit. And that is something that's gone on to be quite an enduring trait of Kizaru, who uses very little haki, presumably because his character has very little willpower. But TLDR, I don't think that Silver Axe is Zephyr, but if Oda can make it work, then I'm open to the twist. And also, even if he isn't Zephyr, he might still be the traitor. We need yet another chapter to understand just how hot Shaki is. The Gorosei fawning over her is probably the next thing we will see. So I think that is when some shark jumping would happen. The Five Elders view humans as insects, and I feel like it would be a form of bestiality for them to feel attraction to a disgusting lowly human. But then again, the Five Elders, they're ruled over by Emu, who himself appears to be eternally simping for Nefertari Lily. So I guess anything could happen. But my instinct is that it would be a bad move to have Shaki be capable of crippling even the Five Elders. However, there is every chance that this question will be answered, as if we see the God Valley incident, and if Shaki is part of it, then we know that Saint J. Garcia Saturn was on the island at the time, so we could see his reaction to Shaki, and that would answer this question quite nicely, or at least hopefully quite nicely. Am I the only one who feels like the God Valley incident loses a lot of its legendary status if it turns out the reason it happened was because of Shaki? I'm not sure about that. I feel like it has the potential to be the other way around, for the legend of God Valley to grow, because the way these pieces are falling is starting to make it sound like a Helen of Troy sort of situation, which sparked an entire Trojan War. However, I can see where the diminishment comes from, and it's probably because of how wacky Rox and Roger are going over Shaki. It's not some manly pursuit of love, it's two drooling Sims fighting over a woman who wants neither of them, and it does have the potential to be pretty incredibly cringy if Oda doesn't write it well, but I do have faith that he will if this is where we're going. And if so, I also love how well Shaki's role fits into One Piece history so far as we know it. If Shaki were to be a major catalyst of the God Valley incident, then it makes so much sense as to why the world government immediately offered Boa Hancock a warlord position when she was only 18 years old after her first outing as a pirate, because the world government would not have forgotten the chaos that Shaki's beauty caused, and how her very existence was almost able to completely destabilize the world planet. And Shaki did all of that without Boa Hancock's devil fruit powers, which makes her infinitely more dangerous than Shaki ever could have been in theory. Because if Boa Hancock had Shaki's more flirtatious personality and was more willing to adventure out and spend time with men in general, then she would probably be a similar threat to the planet right now. One more thing with God Valley though, another reason why some people may find it underwhelming is because that's just the nature of solving mysteries. The answers to questions are almost never as exciting as being asked a question. And so the more we learn about God Valley, that mystique and legendary status it once had was always going to fade away, at least somewhat. Man on the internet, what are your opinions on Shiki being a Kurozumi? His antics are just like them, just something that tickled my brain. I do think his personality fits the Kurozumi clan quite well, but he doesn't have their trademark lavender hair color. Not that every Kurozumi member does. Higurashi has more platinum limey kind of hair, although Semimaru does appear to have had the lavender, which is just faded with old age. But Shiki being a Kurozumi would make sense in that Shiki does have a connection to Kurozumi Higurashi, who we still haven't seen yet with the Rocks Pirates. And we do know that Higurashi left Wano at some point and went traveling. She was very potentially a Rocks Pirate member, because it wasn't just Shiki that she encountered, she also had the face of Buckingham Stussy at one point. So if she and Shiki were family, then that would make this connection fit quite nicely. I am 100% sure that we will be shown how Kuma got to Amazon Lily in a flashback, and we're going to see Eva genderbend Dragon and Kuma, lol. Alright, 100, that's such a high percentage. But we do know that Kuma must have been on Amazon Lily to have it logged in his special travel Bible, and he probably had some experience, or I guess knowledge of its culture and its residents to know that this was the place that he needed to send Luffy. And Ivankov helping out may not be out of the question, because we do already have seen a female Kuma drawn by Oda, courtesy of one of the SBS segments. And I would like to note that female Kuma wears lipstick in the style of daughter Jewelry Bonnie, which in retrospect was an early connecting of the two of them. But alternatively, Kuma could have been one of those special Luffy men who had no attraction to Boa Hancock at all, and so was able to infiltrate without significant issue. Although the most simple solution is still probably that Kuma was sent to Amazon Lily as part of his duties as a warlord, like how he was sent to Thriller Bark to deliver a message to Gecko Moria. Boa Hancock was probably doing Hancocky stuff and not responding to all government communication, and so in response to that no response, they sent in the big boy. Random, but as a huge Ace fan ever since the Seraphim were introduced, I thought, why not make a clone of the son of Roger? They had him prisoner, so they could easily have gotten a DNA sample. Maybe the 7 warlords ones are a test, and the strongest ones like Whitebeard, Ace, Roger, and maybe even Zebek himself are all ready and waiting now. They definitely had the chance to acquire Ace's DNA when he was a prisoner. However, look, if I was a world government, then I would probably institute some sort of ban on cloning him specifically. And I guess not just him either, but anyone with the will of D. The world government do not want another potential Roger or a Joy Boy emerging, which is why they went to such great lengths to try and exterminate Ace before he was even born, and why they had to have a whole Paramount war just to execute him. We have yet to see a D clone, even though there is potential that the Mads Project had Rox's DNA and also tried to clone him alongside Whitebeard and Buckingham Stussy. But it may also be seen as a very taboo thing no matter where you fall in terms of ideology, to clone the D. I believe by the end of the year we will still be in flashbackception. I'd say probably not, but at the same time, I don't know if I'd be complaining if we were. As of recording this video, here is a scarysome thought, but we only have an estimated 13 chapters of One Piece left in 2025, which is a crazy thing to say with it only being August, but that's just how Oda's schedule works these days. And that's if there's no unexpected breaks. We're looking at 13 maximum, but it could be less than that. And 13 in the context of flashbacks is a big number, and it would be unprecedented to still be in a flashback by the time that this year ends, as currently the longest flashback in One Piece is Kozuki Oden, who we spent 13.5 chapters with, and this Loki, Harold Rocks, Shaki flashback is currently gone on for 5.5 chapters, and it has been moving pretty damn quickly in that time. So we've still got to wrap up Rocks, and we've got to move on to Harold, got to see the horn ripping. We haven't even seen him encounter the Holy Knights yet. And then finally, we need to see how and why Harold died. So there is still a fair bit left to go through. So unless things get pretty abruptly cut sometime soon, there is a very good chance that we'll still be in this flashback until November, maybe December. But this could also become the longest flashback in the series, and we may not see Monday Elbaf again until 2026. That could happen. It's not what I would bet on at this stage though, unless Oda needs to take some pretty sudden and unexpected breaks. I think Roger's base is a fraud for thinking that One Piece is going to end in 2027. It will still be ongoing in 2030 at least, I assure you. Alright, so fraud, that's a bit harsh. Mr. Base is not a fraud, to the best of my knowledge. But having brought up the timeline for the rest of 2025, I cannot see One Piece ending in 2027. That would be madness. That would mean that if the series ended at the very end of 2027, the very final slot for a chapter it could be, that we would only have somewhere between 77 to 85 chapters left of the series in total, which is about the length of Whole Cake Island. And there is just no way that I can see everything being wrapped up in that time frame, especially since we haven't even finished Elbaf yet. Once we do, I think we'll have a better idea of the end point of One Piece, but there's a lot to resolve here. 2027, it's too soon. Mr. Internet Man, what do you think will happen to the Celestial Dragons at the end of One Piece? Many people say they will all be killed or imprisoned, but I hope that Oda finds a better solution. So what I think will happen is that all of the world nobles will perform some sort of collective action that will doom themselves. Because I find it very difficult to see Eiichiro Oda using his protagonist to kill them all, and I also find the answer of them all being imprisoned quite unsatisfying after their egregious crimes against humanity. So I think their fate is going to be entirely in their own hands. Like, say the Red Line is collapsing, but they refuse to leave Marijois because it's the Holy Land, and they think they're gods, so they think they're going to be fine, but then they all end up falling to their oblivion. Something like that. Internet Man, do you still think Eustass Kid could make a narrative comeback in Elbaf, or is it Jova for the Kid Pirates? I honestly thought that he would have made an appearance by now. That we would get to Elbaf and Kid would be either imprisoned or freshly fished out of the water, but he's just nowhere to be seen, so I don't know anymore. But I think it would be really weird to leave Elbaf without addressing Kid's whereabouts. Down south, ex-technician pirate-loving Internet Man, do you have any One Piece Lego? I do, actually. My wife recently got me the live-action Baratier set for my birthday, which I've slowly been working through, and it's pretty damn cool. There's a lot of technical brilliance that's gone into designing it, although it has made me really wish that there was One Piece Lego based on the anime and the manga, because I would go pretty crazy for something like a Whole Cake Chateau, a Water 7, or an Onigashima build. Imagine Roger pulls up to Shaki's bar and recreates Luffy and Blackbeard's first encounter with rocks. So that would be pretty fantastic in my opinion. Roger wants to visit this fabled pirate paradise, potentially because he knows that that's where Shaki is, and he rocks up to the bar and has the same interaction that Luffy had with Blackbeard on Jaya, and that is how the Roger Rocks rivalry begins. Although another, possibly non-Shaki reason why Roger may turn up is because there's supposed to be a poneglyph on Hachinosu. I'm not sure when it got there, but that was the reason why Law went to Hachinosu and caused the Rocky Port incident. So we may have a potential poneglyph sighting incoming in this flashback as well. And it may even serve as the first time that Roger or anyone has seen a poneglyph, because the Roger pirates don't reach Lodestar Island until 39 years ago according to the One Piece timeline. So that is something very fun to look forward to. If this flashback continues at its expansive rate, we may actually see the Roger pirates landing at the official final island in the New World, Lodestar, which we would have no reason to see otherwise. The Straw Hats don't really need to go there because they already know about the poneglyphs and have almost everything they need to head straight to Laugh Tale, but I would love to see Roger's journey and what the official end of the New World looks like. Leg Zeff was a pirate named for his famed leg dyed red from being soaked in the blood of his enemies, and he was an infinitely more powerful and infamous pirate than you may think. Zeff doesn't talk about his history much, but he once served as the cook for a world-famous pirate prior to captaining his own crew that sailed in the Grand Line and the New World, also potentially being one of the very first characters we saw using Haki in One Piece, and knowing just a little too much about the Will of D. So Leg Zeff, how high will your ceiling go? The short answer to that is very high, but the long answer is the rest of this video. Mr. Zeff is 67 years old, which puts his career in the prime era of piracy, as former pirate king Goldie Roger was only 10 years older than Zeff, whilst figures like Charlotte Lin was only a single year older, and other prominent menfolk like Kozuki Oden was actually 8 years younger than Zeff. So Zeff slots quite comfortably into this era of legends, and if he got got his start at a young age, he would have experienced the era of rocks and the era of Roger, and finally the golden age of piracy, with Zeff's career ending during the golden age. And Zeff's past has been hinted at by Sanji, who said Chef Zeff used to cook for a famous pirate. So Zeff's history is tied to one of the big historical names in the world. We just don't know who that name belongs to at the time of this recording. What I would say at the moment is that it's unlikely to have been the biggest of all of the name havers, Goldie Roger, because we have seen a fairly extensive history of Roger's crew at this point, and Zeff has made no such appearance among them. However, I think it's quite likely that Zeff crossed paths with Roger or another wielder of the Mighty D, because Zeff very quickly recognized their qualities within Luffy, and so Zeff said to Sanji, "Watch him closely, Sanji. Once in a long while, a fool comes along who, having set his sights on something, won't quit fighting till he dies." It's a real nuisance to have a fella like that for an enemy. Whether he wins or loses this fight, I admire a man like that. And so Zeff here is speaking as if he's come across or even fought against someone with the will of D. And given the era we're talking about, the kind of man Zeff is describing could be found in Goldie Roger, perhaps Monkey D. Garp, or even, tantalizingly, a Rox D. Zebek. As the only two other active Ds that we're aware of operating during this era would be Jaguar D. Soul, who was a Marine, and Zeff could have feasibly encountered him, but the second would be Cloud D. Clover, who was sailing the world to uncover the mystery of the Void Century. I do think that Clover's the least likely candidate, because he is significantly older than Zeff, and so their eras may not have smoothly crossed over. So I do think we're looking at Garp, Roger, or Rox. And in regards to Mr. Garp, the One Piece live action series actually has a scene featuring both Zeff and Garp, where Garp does appear to be very familiar with Zeff. And there's a lot of fun stuff in this discussion. It's one of the better live action scenes, where Zeff also references having been on Gyre and cooking himself an delicious boar. But more importantly, in this scene, Zeff states that Luffy reminds him of, quote, another pirate we knew back in our glory days, which is then clarified to be Roger. Now, the live action is obviously not to be taken as any sort of canon, but also Eiichiro Oda himself did have final say over a lot of the season 1 stuff, and if he had a big issue with Zeff having known Roger and Garp, then we probably wouldn't have this scene. And I do think it's quite true to the legacy of Zeff. It's never heavily focused on, but the manga consistently alludes to Zeff being a far bigger deal than the East Blue era of storytelling would initially have us believe. And during the Baratie arc, it is my hypothesis that Mihawk was not the only living legend present. Although the live action probably does play up how much Zeff quote-unquote knew Roger. And something quite interesting was revealed recently about the Roger Pirates. In the SBS of Volume 112, Oda revealed the key roles of the Roger Pirates, which at face value can seem like mostly superfluous information. But according to Mr. Oda, the Roger Pirates had no dedicated cook aboard their ship, which is difficult to believe because it's one of those most basic roles that a crew needs to survive, like a doctor. Although the Roger Pirates also did not have a dedicated doctor until a few decades into their journey, as they only recruited Crocus at the very tail end of the adventure in order to manage Roger's incurable disease. So you know what, actually, if they spent all of that time without a doctor, then maybe they didn't have a cook either, and they survived in a way best described as somehow. But this revelation resulted in this amazing meme of the Roger Pirates doing the iconic, albeit slightly altered, Alabasta salute, rejecting Zeff from their crew, because they don't need no cook, even if he is probably the greatest cook of their era. This would feel like such a colossal retcon, but it may be possible that Oda didn't reveal the cook because he wants to keep Zeff's involvement with the Roger Pirates a sneaky secret. But at the same time, I don't know why he wouldn't have revealed it before now with as much of the Roger Pirates as we've seen. So right now, I think that's one famous pirate off the table, and let us examine another Rox D. Zebek. Zeff's persona was described as the kind of man who attracted hot-blooded pirate types, which is why Baratie constantly slides into these shouting matches and infighting amongst the chefs, and also the customers, which I will say is very reminiscent of how the Rox Pirates operated. But Zeff, I think, is unlikely to have been a Rox pirate for several reasons. One is that Big Mom should have made a bigger deal about who he was when Sanji was threatened with Zeff's life during Whole Cake Island if they were former crewmates. And the second is that Zeff appears as the captain of his own crew in Chapter 0, the Cook Pirates, and Zeff's crew don't appear to be familiar with Golden Lion Shiki, one of the more famous Rox alumni. Now that doesn't mean that Zeff himself was unfamiliar with Shiki. His dialogue is quite vague, but it does make that connection a little bit less likely. Although I would love to see Zeff as part of the Rocks Pirates, if only to have a scene with he and Stroyson developing some sort of a cook-based rivalry. But we are running out of famous pirates now. It's probably not Roger or Rocks. I don't know, it could be both of them, but probably not. Shiki, he's off the table, as is Big Mom. I can't see Zeff cooking for Kaido, although I could see him maybe cooking for Whitebeard. But whoever it is a name within that sphere of influence. But ultimately, Zeff would leave whichever crew it was to become the captain of the Cook Pirates, which were dedicated to pursuing his dream of finding the All Blue. Now, I should say we have a Don Krieg content warning here, because he's going to get talked about a lot. And the reason being that things get a little bit confusing because Don Krieg knows that Zeff kept a log of his voyage into the Grand Line, which is weird in and of itself. How does Krieg immediately know that? Is Zeff simply that famous that he has a narrative legacy? Like how everyone seems to know the legend of Captain John's treasure and the treasure mark to find it? Is that the tale of Zeff and his logbook? But Krieg also gives us more detail as he states that Zeff's journey in the Grand Line lasted only a single year. And in Sanji's flashback, Zeff confirms this when he states that he was unable to find the All Blue in his 1-year voyage. However, what he saw during that year made him believe that the All Blue does indeed exist. Now, this often leads to people thinking that Zeff spent only a single year as a pirate, but that is very inaccurate. The truth is that he only spent a single year as a pirate captain in the Grand Line searching for the All Blue. But he was a pirate long before that, cooking for another crew, and he was a pirate long after that as a captain, just not operating in the Grand Line. And a year may not sound like a long time, but in this world, it really is. As not including the time skip, the Straw Hats have only been traveling for somewhere between 7 to 8 months. So at this rate, a year in the Grand Line and in the New World is probably long enough to become Pirate King. And 1 year was also approximately how long Gecko Mortia's career lasted, and he made quite a deep run into the New World in that time. Also, this is crazy, but worth bringing up. Don Krieg believed that Zeff's logbook contained some sort of trick to sailing through the Grand Line, and he goes on to say that, with some luck, the logbook also might contain the location of the One Piece itself. To which one of Krieg's crew members replies, "That Don Krieg, what a brain." And I agree, what a brain, a faulty brain. However, what if Krieg was onto something? To him, Zeff is so famous that equating him to being able to find the One Piece is a natural connection. So what if Zeff's logbook did contain the location of a certain laugh tale? And if so, you may or may not remember that Luffy refused Zeff's offer to take his logbook after defeating Don Krieg. The reason why you may or may not remember that is because it depends on whether you read the manga or watched the anime. This event plays out very differently, as it's only in the anime that Zeff offers Luffy the logbook, which Luffy refuses, saying that he didn't want to copy someone else's adventure. And Zeff smiles, knowing that this was likely going to be Luffy's response, which I think is a really good addition made by the anime there, and something that remains very consistent with Luffy later down the track. In the manga, Zeff doesn't offer Luffy his logbook at all, which I think is a shame, because it means that this moment I'm speculating on doesn't actually exist. If this logbook moment was canon, I would be almost 100% certain that Zeff at some stage met Roger and they had a similar discussion, which is why Zeff was ever so confident that Luffy would reject his offer. But ultimately, that didn't happen, and also we don't know exactly what year it is that Zeff spent captaining his crew in the Grand Line. What we do know is that Zeff's pirating career came to an end 11 years ago, but we have also seen him as the captain of the Cook Pirates 22 years ago during Chapter 0 when he was commenting on Shiki's escape. And we don't know where Zeff was at this time. This very much could have been during that 1 year in the Grand Line. But we're looking at potentially around the same time that Roger finally found Laugh Tale, but it could also have been much earlier. And given that Zeff was searching for the All Blue, there is little doubt in my mind that Zeff also made it into the New World. In fact, Zeff was the very first person in the series to refer to the first half of the Grand Line as Paradise. On Baratie, he told Luffy about this name, and it made Luffy all the more excited to go and explore it. And it would take us a couple of hundred chapters to find out the pirates referred to the Grand Line as Paradise only in comparison to the New World. Pirates who have been powerful and resourceful enough to make the leap from Grand Line to New World are often completely overwhelmed by the apocalyptic conditions and level of power required to simply exist in the New World that they flee back to the paradise of the Grand Line. So generally, a character who refers to the Grand Line as Paradise only does so because they understand the New World. They've been there, they've seen bad things. And also, another thing, not that data books should be trusted too much, but in One Piece Data Book Green, Zeff's knowledge of Paradise is actually actually highlighted, and it is heavily implied that he has been to the New World, which would automatically put him at a level of strength unfathomable to our East Blue impression, but then again, it wouldn't necessarily be inconsistent with what we see of Zeff, as our first meeting with Zeff was after this 67-year-old man took a cannonball straight to the face when Luffy accidentally deflected it into Baratier. And remember that not even Whitebeard was immune to stuff like cannonballs and bullets. It just took a hell of a lot of them to ultimately bring him down. And Zeff, he was looking pretty damn good for a man who'd just taken a cannon to the face. Zeff was also able to strike and injure Luffy with his peg leg, and typically this sort of attack would do nothing to Luffy because he is rubber. However, this kick to the neck hit Luffy harder than any of his actual East Blue opponents. Other than Garp, this could be Luffy's first experience of being hit by Haki. And Zeff's power, furthermore, was described as follows: that awesome leg strength could smash bedrock and even leave footprints in steel. Now, steel, that's pretty cool, but I should point out that smashing bedrock isn't that crazy of a feat in One Piece, and Luffy did it quite early on in his round 3 against Crocodile, punching him up through the solid bedrock covering the Alabaster Tomb. But still, nothing to scoff at, and my personal theory is that if Zeff fought during Baratier, then he would have obliterated Don Krieg and his crew. However, with that theory, the question becomes, well, why didn't he just do that? Surely that's a much simpler solution. Well, there's several reasons for this. The first is that Zeff made a deal with Luffy before any of the fighting began, which is that if Luffy could get rid of Don Krieg, then he wouldn't have to be a chore boy anymore. And when first going through One Piece as an innocent to fictional pirate of Virgin, I think the temptation is to view this deal as Zeff eagerly accepting the help of someone stronger than him, because Zeff and his chefs are not capable of defeating Krieg alone. But over 1,100 chapters and or episodes later, your eyes return to this deal as a seasoned fictional pirate Giga Chad, and what they see is something completely different. During the Clash of Baratier, Zeff is at no stage concerned about Don Krieg or any of his merry men, and Zeff actually goes so far as to pity Krieg by mentioning how they tried to enter the Grand Line but ran away scared. Zeff has zero concern over a man who has yet to accomplish the very basics of piracy. He couldn't even survive a week in the Grand Line. He's no threat to Zeff. And going back on it, when making the deal with Luffy, Zeff appears to agree because he thinks that spending a whole year with Luffy will cause more damage to Baratier than simply letting him fight against the Krieg pirates would. So there's a comically logistical aspect to this, but the main reason, the main meat of why Zeff chose to do nothing on Baratier is all about Sanji. Zeff's goal was to get Sanji to leave the restaurant to pursue his dreams, which Sanji kept refusing to do because he felt indebted to Zeff. So Zeff wanted Luffy to set an example for Sanji. He wanted Sanji to see a man who would relentlessly pursue his own dreams no matter what the cost. Zeff wanted Luffy to inspire Sanji. But if Zeff were to jump in and just save the day again, that would only make Sanji feel more indebted and tighten the chains that Sanji has put on himself. And I should say the one time that Zeff did show off a little bit was to put out and pacify all of Pearl's fire projectiles, which Zeff did with, frankly, a level of speed and skill not possessed by anyone present at the time, showing that Zeff was a force to be reckoned with and he was choosing to be inactive. Now, there is one issue with this hypothesis, which comes when Zeff gets taken hostage by Gin, which a man of the strength level that I'm proposing would be unlikely to fall victim to. But I have an answer for this as well, and this might sound kind of dark. However, I honestly would not be surprised if Zeff allowed himself to be taken hostage and was ready to sacrifice himself in order to allow Sanji to be free. As it's during this section we get Sanji's speech about how bound he is. I took everything that old man had, his strength, his dreams, so I'll never let anything else be taken from him. To which Zeff replies, "This is no time to spout rubbish, eggplant." And I think that Zeff feels responsible for denying Sanji his dream, in the same way that Sanji feels responsible for taking Zeff's dream. And perhaps the only solution at this point to freeing Sanji is for Zeff to sacrifice himself. Is it a stupid thing to do? Yes. But have father figures done stupid things for their children in One Piece always? Also, yes. And to that point, Zeff even smiles when, still being held at gunpoint, Luffy starts destroying Baratier because its destruction is freeing Sanji from his mental debt to Zeff. Zeff doesn't want Baratier to exist at all if it's going to keep Sanji trapped. We also don't see how Gin got Zeff into that position, nor do we see Zeff get out of that position because Gin switches sides and lets him go. However, my personal feeling is that if Zeff Zeff did not want to be held at gunpoint, then Gin would have had no chance against him. And we should mention that Zeff's pirating career was brought to a halt by a force that no one can overcome. He lost his ship and his crew in a vicious weather storm, and the weather is the one thing that all pirates are at the mercy of, no matter how powerful they are. Even Golden Lion Shiki in his prime lost half of his fleet and had a steering wheel embedded into his head because he got caught up in an unexpected storm. And Shiki was considered to be on the same level as Roger and Whitebeard during their triumvirate era. So if even Shiki can succumb to a storm, it doesn't say all that much that Zeff did as well. And Zeff also has a very profound quote about this very issue. "The ocean is vast and brutal. The vastness of this ocean, people die cursing it. How many people has it swallowed?" And to his, pun intended, legacy, I would also say that the ability to gracefully remove one's limb isn't something that we've seen from a lot of low-tier individuals. As one of the only other examples we have is Shanks willingly giving his arm to the Lord of the Coast, and there is that powerful connection between Zeff and Shanks, as both of whom willingly gave their limbs to bet on the next generation. So in many ways you can view Zeff as a legend in equivalence to Shanks. He's obviously not at that very top-tier emperor level, however Red Leg Zeff in his prime would have been a truly terrifying man. Someone skilled enough to captain a vessel in the Grand Line and the New World, someone powerful enough to potentially clash with the likes of Roger and Garp, and miraculously live to reminisce about it decades later. That is the kind of man that Red Leg Zeff was. Other than Rox, who took up the whole first video I had to make about this chapter, there was another pretty colossal lore drop that I don't know if enough people quite appreciate. As during this chapter, Mr. Jarl and Mr. Harald are having a lovely sit down when Jarl mentions a group of giants curiously called the Galera Warhammer Company. And in my last video, I referred to them as ancient giants, which is a minor speech mistake on my part. I mean, it is kind of true. What I meant was that they were an ancient group of giants, but it did also apparently contain some actual ancient giants as well. And they're all so old that Harold believes them to be a mere myth, but Jarl knows that they existed because he received a final letter from them. These seem to have been almost like giant nomads traveling the world until they were captured, that is. Over 100 warriors caught, which is insane by the way. It is no easy task to subdue 100 giants with ancient giants among them. And seemingly unrelated, I'm actually not sure, Jarl also states that there is a frozen army of giants out in there somewhere, which we know for a fictional fact does exist, and this appears to have solved one of the largest lingering mysteries of One Piece, which is what was that really weird and disturbing part of Punk Hazard where Nami, Chopper, and the kids find their way into a cavern stuffed with frozen giants, many of them wearing prisoner outfits. Many, but not all. But if you put the pieces together, this is probably Galera. They were said to be captured, makes sense since they're wearing prison outfits, and there's also said to be a frozen army, and that makes sense as well. There's like 100 dudes here. And if you look at the top right corner, there's even one particularly massive giant who fits the aesthetic qualities of an ancient giant, but also at least two of these giants are 99% the same characters that Oda showed us in silhouette in this chapter. The easiest one to identify is Big Chonko in the middle. I would bet everything in your bank account, not mine, that this is the same Big Chonko in the middle of the Punk Hazard cavern. They are identical. Now the second one is a little bit harder to spot, but I reckon that this dude in the foreground holding the hammer is also this dude doing the nothing happened pose in the frozen cavern. And after using my eyes for a little bit more, I also think that these two dudes may be the same person. So depending on how fictional science works, we might be able to unfreeze these guys in the future. And that could give us roughly 100 giants who have lived during the Void Century, or at the very least lived closer to it than Jarl did. And I really cannot overstate how much sense this makes all over the series, not just Punk Hazard, because my immediate thought was Fishman Island. And I'm now pretty convinced that it was this clan of shipwrights that built the Noah, as after Luffy's attempt to destroy the Noah to save Fishman Island, the Sea King state, the ship is falling to pieces. Can it be fixed? Can it be used? I cannot say. We will need their help to fix it. But it is a different age now. And mate, they have to be talking about these giants. And if so, what we've got to do, right, is we've got to go back to Punk Hazard to unfreeze them so that we can go back even further so that they can go and fix the Noah on Fishman Island. Almost like backtracking our way through the New World. And the second object of interest that they almost certainly built was the ancient weapon Pluton. This frozen clan of shipwrights almost certainly built Pluton as well, as in Frankie's flashback when he sees the blueprints, what he says is, can humans really build this? And the answer to that may be no, they can't, but giants, yes they can. Especially since they have essentially the same name as Galila, and all of the skills of the Water 7 shipwrights likely originate from these guys. And the really stupid, oh my god, so stupid thing is that when you look at the Galila logo, it is a Viking longboat. So of course they were founded by giants. And that's also likely why Frankie has more of a role on Elbaf than he did on Egghead Island. You would expect his story to be tied more to Vegapunk and science, but think about it. This dude inherited the skills of these ancient giants. However, there is a however, being that the Galila Company, as we know it, has only existed for 7 years. Before that, it was 7 separate companies, each inhabiting one of the, how shall we say, giant docks of Water 7. Iceberg was the one who quote-unquote founded Galila, and after this reveal, I'd say that's likely from stories of the past told by Tom, of a time when Water 7 was thriving long before it was sinking, and when it was still experiencing the glory days of the original Galila. And just in case anyone has forgotten, it is confirmed that Pluton was originally built on Water 7, and so the many other companies who occupied the 7 docks may very well have been remnants of this original Galila. And so in retrospect, it's also kind of nice that Oimo and Kashi were saved on Enies Lobby in part due to the company that these giants founded, and that they also stayed to help Galila for a bit after the Enies Lobby incident. So there's all sorts of wonderful little connections popping up everywhere, as this here smug story prick sits high on his throne and says, mates, I set this up all along and you didn't see it. Huh? Really, this could have been a whole chapter of its own. We didn't need the rocks reveal in this chapter, and at that point it's just flexing. However, it needs to be said that there is a greater purpose to revealing this information more so than just connecting all sorts of fun dots. As in the context of this chapter, Jarl is using the story of this company, and the story that I think he believes to be unrelated about a frozen giant army, as a warning to Harold about how giants are viewed in the world, which is a feeling very similar to the prejudice against fishermen, buccaneers, Lunarians, and every other race that originally stood against the world government. Wise old Jarl man says that there's probably a deeper reason why relations between humans and giants haven't historically worked out, although that only goes on to emphasize the achievements of Harold in this chapter, who was able to form an incredible multinational coalition to end the famine of Elbaf, and this panel of all of the human ships arriving at Elbaf is so powerful. The idea of humans being willing to share their food to feed a civilization of giants is, think about that for a bit. Every giant requires something like 100 times the amount of food that any given human would. And for so many countries to all come together for this common cause, it is a complete antithesis of Jarl's words. And that is how I know that something real bad is about to happen. It is a flashback, and so we should expect bad things to happen, but the Harold that we see in this chapter is a man who is on the verge of opening Elbaf to the world and forever changing the relations between giants and humans. Relations that we know today are still as tenuous as they ever were. So something is going to happen to sabotage Harold's efforts. When the ships are arriving, Harold says that if these good folk are ever in a pinch, then it will be our job to return the favor to them, which could be a little bit of foreshadowing. There's one possibility, that being that the nations that helped Elbaf get into trouble, and for whatever reason, the giants do not help them, severing all of the goodwill that Harold built. Because as we know from this chapter, most civilizations are only a few missed meals away from taking rather dire action, and this chapter did open up with my prediction of what would happen from the last video, which is that we are shown the tragedy of Charlotte Lin on the winter solstice. And this is a demonic child. Baby Loki in the last chapter, as well as this one, is framed as some sort of a spawn of hell for having eyes that are a little bit out of ordinary. But this chapter immediately reminds us what a true demon looks like, with whatever entity of hunger resides within Charlotte Charlotte Lin. And we now have a lot more context as to why the Giants hate her. It's not just because of her immediate actions, but it's also because Lin appears to have heralded an age of famine for Elbaf. And I really enjoy the irony of that. Lin went into her tantrum mode because she felt like she was starving. And one way of looking at the demonic entity that is Charlotte Lin from the perspective of Elbaf is that she is making them suffer the same hunger that she was forced to endure. If you were a superstitious person, that's one way you could look at it, but another way would be to blame the baby. Always a good idea. It's not like it can defend itself. And I think that Loki may now officially be in contention for most painful flashback in One Piece. In my opinion, the current holder of that title is of course Bartholomew Kuma, and I don't know if he'll ever be unseated because his whole life was a curated degustation of pain. However, I can't help but feel like our Loki may even be quite jealous of Kuma's life, and that is solely for the reason of love. Kuma's life, it was horrifying, it was torturous, but do you know that one thing that he did have? When Kuma was born into the world, he had both parents staring down at him with love overflowing from their eyes. And even though they spent so little time together, Kuma was able to feel that love, and that feeling persisted through his entire life with Ginny and later Bonnie. So even though Loki has physically suffered a lot less than Kuma, there's something uniquely awful about the emptiness of Loki's existence. I mean, that panel where King Harold is holding his child and he's overjoyed, but by that point, at only a few months old, the narrator states that Loki had already given up on love, and the complete indifference that Loki expresses whilst being held up by his father is a whole new realm of pain. He's very much the opposite of Kuma, right down to the idea that he can't hurt himself, or at least not badly enough to be fatal. So while Kuma was a man filled with love and a constant barrage of life-threatening physical pain, Loki is a man devoid of love and is so naturally physically powerful that he can't really feel anything through that avenue either. I spoke about this in the last video, but the whole idea that he threw himself into the underworld, just like how his mother tossed him, in an attempt to potentially do what Estrid originally wanted, is one of the most tragic things that I've ever seen in the series. And as I've said before, the worst part is that all Loki needed was one loving figure in those early days, because look at this baby Loki from this chapter. Even as he terrifyingly bursts into Estrid's room, this child is so adorable and wants nothing more than to just be with his mother. If Harold was around at this point in time, Loki would have turned out to be a completely different person, because I don't think that Harold would have ignored him, although as his life goes on, Harold does appear to be ignoring him. But at the very least, he certainly would not have suggested gouging his son's eyes out like Estrid did. And I'd say that this might be Oda's commentary on the effects of being an absent father, something that he probably feels himself, although probably not, because we're also constantly being shown the other end of this spectrum as well, with Ida raising Haradin. And Haradin looks a lot more like your classical rascal child. He's kind of grumpy because from his perspective, he has this overly doting mother and he wants to be a big, brave giant warrior man. And big, brave giant warrior men do not have their mothers pinching their cheeks and telling them how adorable they are. It's quite cute for a bit until this is immediately juxtaposed against Loki's experience and you realize that everything Haradin has is everything Loki wanted. He wasn't born as some demonic baby who had ambitions of destroying the world. He was born as someone who just wanted his cheeks pinched by his mother. And after seeing all of this, I am more interested than ever to see what happened with Charlotte Lola. Again, this chapter states that Loki gave up on love. However, we do know that he does eventually give love another go when he proposes to Lola. And I think that this is now going to be a surprisingly gut-punching moment, because Loki's going to try and pursue some brand of love for the second time in his life, and he's going to get promptly rejected, just like how his mother rejected him. Sometimes Oda has this really frustrating talent to transmute comedy into drama. A good example of this would be Senor Pink, ridiculously dressed, but once you learn the story behind why he dresses, my heart. And previously, I've always viewed this Lola proposal as more of the comedy side of the spectrum, but now I almost don't want to see it, because this scene is going to crush an already very broken boy. But keeping with the dark and hurtsome feel, something that I did appreciate seeing this chapter is what I've been inquiring about throughout the whole arc, which is, where are all the Prejudice giants we keep hearing about? We've been constantly told that Haradin is considered tainted, and that Ida is viewed as this unworthy outsider, and this chapter does finally give us a bit of that reality. Because when things get desperate, it's very interesting to see just how quickly society breaks down, and blame gets assigned to those viewed as the outsiders. Because Ida is a foreigner, she's viewed as this salacious woman who seduced our pure and poor King Harold and injected turmoil into the country. And because Harudin also shares her foreign blood, he's also seen as not just a problem, but an unfortunate solution. This unnamed giant wants to sacrifice Harudin, and let's just unpack that for a bit. This giant specifically says that it was a Loki who was the one who doomed this country, but instead of wanting to kill Loki, which is also wrong, he goes for Harudin, blaming the, in what have been their words, the impure blood for the crimes of the pure blood. It is complete and utter madness, but I think not an inaccurate depiction of desperation by Oda. Anarchy is a state that any civilization is a lot closer to than they believe, and when that blood starts boiling, people start making very illogical and poorly emotionally driven decisions. Although in defense of the Giants of Elbaf, I don't consider myself separate from them. I think that most humans would succumb to this level of madness if we'd experienced what they had. It probably becomes a lot easier to believe in the idea of sacrifices when you've been assaulted by a being who appears to be a flat-out demon and or wrathful god, and nothing but ironic nationwide misfortune has hit you afterwards. If that was to happen, people are going to very quickly turn to a higher power explanation. But this then allows Oda to do what he does best and emphasize the importance of a good leader. Although I'm a bit conflicted on Harold in this chapter and overall. I feel like he is quite neglectful of Loki as a cost to his diplomatic dreams, which are objectively good and putting Elbaf on the right path, but it's stuff like Harold not even questioning Loki's eye condition that makes me question him. I don't know, I find it a bit weird that Harold wouldn't even bother to look at the eyes of his son. He just accepts there's a condition and keeps them wrapped up. And it does hit that much harder knowing for a fact that Loki's blindfold wasn't something he chose, but something that was forced upon him. It's quite sickening. In an attempt for the giants to blind themselves from Loki's eyes, they instead blind Loki himself. But I did really like the part where Loki was beating up Harudin and Gerd started to run in to defend him. Goldberg then tries to stop her, but he gets beaten up as a result as well, because Gerd has her own little small arc playing out, which all has to do with friendship. As a child, Gerd was also good friends with Charlotte Linlin, and I think that Gerd does feel some guilt for what happened, as in chapter 1133, she says that she used to be friends with Linlin, but then she did something unforgivable to Elbaf. And this could just be my reading, but it doesn't look like Gerd's personally angry or upset about it. It's more that the social and cultural position of Elbaf now forbids this friendship she once had, and I think that bond is something that Gerd never wants to betray again. Which is why, even if it means potentially being beaten up by Loki, Gerd will jump in for her friend. And I also think that Gerd may be one of the only giants on the island who does feel some sympathy for Loki, again because of the Charlotte Linlin incident. Gerd has seen what happens when a child gets demonized, and in the case of Loki, yes, he's done some horrible stuff by this point as a child, but he is nowhere near on the level that Linlin was. And you can see the sympathy playing out in the modern day. Gerd is quite kind to Loki while she's treating his wounds, and from her perspective, Loki isn't irredeemable as Harudin currently believes he is. When Loki fired up Ragnir, Gerd pleaded with him and said, "Stop this, Loki. If you hit the children, there's no turning back. Because if he were to even accidentally harm the children, then he will have committed that Linlin level crime against Elbaf, and there will be no hope of ever reconciling." I mean, I say reconciling, that would mean to restore a relationship, but in the case of Loki, those relationships never existed. Again, bro gave up on love just a few months into his life. But even now, Gerd clearly still has hope that Loki and Harudin can work out their differences and become friends and brothers and avoid Loki going down the path of Charlotte Linlin. Because this big old story of Elbaf really does seem to boil down to Loki wanting to feel like someone actually values his existence. And that someone is Luffy. From the very beginning, Luffy has potentially been the only person in this world who's ever interacted with Loki like a normal person. Luffy sees Loki for who he really is. However, we just have the rather unfortunate hurdle to jump of Luffy being the opposite of everything that Rock stood for, and that aligning with Luffy would put all of Loki's giant eggs in the big ol' Roger basket. But there is definitely still hope for Loki. It's gonna get a hell of a lot worse before it gets better, but I have faith that it will get better. In a historical anomaly never repeated before or since, someone infiltrated the Chamber of Flowers at the very core of the Holy Land. The man described himself as a worshipper of Davy Jones. And that man was Rocks Zeff, a figure who built his entire crew through the tradition of Davy Jones known as the Davy Back Fight. But not just that, because 1 year prior to the God Valley incident, the Rocks Pirates and the Roger Pirates had an encounter at a currently unknown location in the world, which resulted in victory for Rocks and bitter defeat for Roger. An event that is currently speculated to have been a Davy Back Fight, where Rocks won something or someone from Roger. I want to go back to the quote that started this video though, where Rocks labeled himself as a worshipper of Davy Jones. Because worshipper, it's a very interesting word that's really starting to unlock the greater puzzle that is Davy Jones. This is not the first time that he has been mentioned. No, Davy Jones has been mentioned multiple times in One Piece before, and each time his name has been used in the context of a supernatural, almost godlike being. And the exact word being used in Japanese is suhaisha, which doesn't necessarily just mean worshipper, it can also mean admirer. For example, in World, Luffy has many of these admirers, but they don't necessarily worship him. Although actually, Luffy's not the greatest example because he himself is more of a literal god than any other character we've met to date. Either way, we need to be paying a lot more attention to past mentions of Davy Jones than we have been. If you read the Viz translation of the English manga, you will know that Davy Jones has been a name mentioned since practically the dawn of One Piece, with the first use of his name being in chapter 33, where Butchie of the Black Cat Pirates claims that, "We plundered countless villages, we sent many a rival crew down to see Davy Jones," which now, almost 1200 more chapters into the series, has much deeper meaning. However, it shouldn't, because Butchie didn't actually say this. One of the big issues with the early Viz translation is that it went very heavy on localization and took a lot of liberties with pirating language and even translation accuracy, choosing to casually insert all sorts of pirating words, concepts, and tropes in places that they did not belong. And this isn't the only time either. Davy Jones is such a well-known pirating trope that it gets sprinkled in a handful of times in early Viz, but none of those times are canon. And the first time that Oda actually wrote Davy Jones into the story is in chapter 306, where Foxy's crew members describing the Davy Back Fight state, "The winner of each game gets to choose one crew member from the opponent's ship. That person will instantly become the loyal subordinate of the enemy captain and swear upon Davy Jones, pirate of the deep sea." And this is how you can tell the difference between a canon mention of Davy Jones and a whatever the crap Viz did. Because after having gone through all of these, a canon mention of Davy Jones refers to him in the context of a worshipped being, whereas non-canon mentions more of a throwaway yada pirate name drop. In the prior case, Foxy's men state that a crew member lost in a Davy Back Fight must swear upon Davy Jones, and when commencing the Davy Back Fight, Foxy tosses three coins into the ocean, which he states that according to traditional rules is an offering for Davy Jones. And when Foxy was first introducing the Davy Back Fight itself, he states that there are, quote, orthodox rules to run the Davy Back Fight, almost as if it's the pirating equivalent of a religious ceremony. I mean, yes, orthodox doesn't necessarily mean religious, but the language around Davy Jones, be it orthodox, traditional, offering, swear upon, it's all pointing in a very religious-like direction. And furthermore, allegedly, anyone who does not obey the rules of the Davy Back Fight is said to go to, quote, Davy Jones's locker as a disgrace to all pirates, which very much sounds like the pirate equivalent of hell. There is an eternal punishment for not obeying the doctrine and the rules of the Davy Back Fight, the rules of Davy Jones. And these rules may also be linked to the existence of devil fruits and the curse placed upon them as the price of consumption. As should fictional fruit consumers be submerged, then they effectively sink all the way down to Davy Jones's locker. No matter what kind of fruit, you could be a lightning, you could be a tree, you could have a rubber penis, or you could be like Becomes and not even use the fruit that you are cursed with. And in the context of Long Ring Long Land, all this sounds like is assorted crap flowing from the mouth of a split-headed fox. However, in the greater context of One Piece, we should also keep in mind that this is also very likely the reason why no one left the Rocks Pirates after Rocks Zeff won their loyalty through his Davy Back Fights. For the most part, we're told that the Rocks Pirates hated their time as part of that crew, but none of them would dare leave lest they be punished by Davy Jones, a power that the Pirate King himself may have even had no choice but to honor. According to fictional pirate history, the Davy Back Fight first began on the island of Hachinosu, quote, long ago. So long ago that the game itself is a myth in equivalence to Davy Jones. However, 48 years ago, the early makeup of the Rocks Pirates revealed that up until recently, Hachinosu had been a dumping ground where overflow prisoners were left to starve to death, and that they had only recently managed to build a sustainable society there, which is primarily thanks to the underworld emperors at the time discovering that there was a colossal deposit of gold on the island. So the underworld factions brought order to the island so that they could mine the sweet, sweet golds. And for most of the Rocks Pirates, their initial quest to commandeer Hachinosu was very gold related as well. Whitebeard likely wanted his share to send back to his village. Miss Buckingham Stussy needed money for scientific research. Golden Lion Shiki, well, it's in his name. And others, many others. But for Roxty Zebek, his ambition was much grander. He stated that he was going to be the future ruler of Hachinosu and that his goal was to build a pirate's paradise. And while the discovery of gold, lots of gold, was a very convenient mechanism to carry out his plan, the reason why Rox chose Hachinosu to be his paradise may have more to do with its significance to Davy Jones, as if this is the island where the Davy Back Fight started, a contest that actively worships Davy Jones, and Hachinosu is almost like a holy land for someone who is a self-proclaimed worshipper of that Davy Jones. In the eyes of Rox Dizabek, this island is the heart and soul of piracy. It is an extremely important symbolic location which is not a first for One Piece, as the location of the original Marineford was chosen because according to Sengoku, it was the island that existed pretty much in the dead center of the planet. So it was a very important symbol of stability, which is why Sengoku took great issue with a certain Blackbeard, claiming that he was going to sink it during the Paramount War. Very bad thing to say, bad man. However, the aforementioned heart and soul of piracy seems to spawn from a very dark and demonic place, as I could go over the legends of Davy Jones as we know it in the real world, but as far as he relates to One Piece, I actually think it's much more useful to hear Oda himself recounting the legend of Davy Jones, because that's what gives us the important context of how Oda sees Davy Jones and how he plans to implement this character in the series. As Oda has once depicted Davy Jones in the SBS of Volume 38, he appears as a very stereotypical Yarumi Hearties kind of pirate, and he's also a very classic Oda SBS character which leans a lot more heavily into a comic depiction, and the dialogue Davy Jones is speaking just says, "It's all mine." And Oda drew this in response to a reader asking about the significance of Davy Jones, with Oda adding the following. There are several different accounts, but in general there was a lying, no-good pirate named Davy Jones, a greedy deck chief who was famous for putting all the crew's valuables in his own locker. He was so wicked, even for a pirate, that one day the devil himself cursed Davy to live at the bottom of the sea forever, swabbing the deck of a sunken ship and placing all the sunken treasure in his locker where it would never be seen again. So when pirates say, "Put him in Davy Jones's locker," it means sink him to the bottom of the sea. Take special note of the word devil being used there by Oda. And also this legend is TLDR'd in the One Piece canon by Nico Robin. When Chopper asks who Davy Jones was, Robin responds with, "A pirate from long ago who was cursed by a demon and is said to live deep down on the sea floor. That's the legend. Any sunken ships or treasure get locked away in Davy Jones's locker." Now, important thing here, the word demon that Robin is using here can also be translated as devil, which is a very relevant distinction, because all those with the will of D are constantly labeled as devils. And any time that Oda brings up the idea of a devil, it is usually in connection to them. But something that I haven't seen brought up very much in all of the Rox hype is the fact that the narrator said that Rox described himself as a worshipper of Davy Jones. So Rox marched into the Chamber of Flowers, locked eyes with Emu, which is the only feature that Emu has, and said that he was a Davy Jones worshipper, as if that had some kind of meaning to Emu, and it may very well, as at this stage Emu could be the very literal devil in the world of One Piece. And also the legend of Davy Jones, according to Oda, goes that Davy Jones was cursed by the devil. So if this character did exist in One Piece, Davy Jones may well have a history with Emu, and Davy Jones could have been a victim of the flooding of the Void Century. And so Rox confronting Emu could be a declaration of revenge on behalf of a figure figure that he greatly admires. But there is also another option, which is that Davy Jones himself was a devil. And one clue to this that we do have is through the Jolly Roger of the Rocks Pirates, which features a horned skull, a very devilish one, if I do say so myself. And if this endeavor was all in the spirit of Davy Jones, then this could be how Rocks chooses to depict him. However, something that was very quickly spotted by assorted men all over the internet is that the skull in the Jolly Roger features a horn with the now trademark Gear 5th swirl. Which brings us to Joy Boy, the only person other than Luffy confirmed to have been capable of producing an aesthetic form of this nature through the power of fictional fruit. Long before chapter 1155 came out, it had been theorized that the Will of D could stand for Davy Jones. But this idea has now evolved into Davy Jones being the real name of Joy Boy, which when you think about it, Joy Boy, it's much more of a title. And the idea from here is that Joy Boy and Davy Jones are two sides of the same coin, the same person, in very much the same way that the sun god Nika has two sides, a liberator and a destroyer. The idea here being that Joy Boy is a fractured legend. Some people remember him as the Joy Boy, the first pirate, the liberator, generally good dude, whereas other people remember his real name, Davy Jones, the destroyer, the wicked, the evil, and also potentially first pirate. In the same sort of way that Luffy has a fractured image in the world currently. Those who have met him know him as a liberator, whilst those who only hear about Luffy in the news know him as an evil, devilish destroyer. And in this case, it may explain the divide within the D clan itself, as Rocks Dizabek has been labeled as the greatest rival of Goldie Roger, with the potentially fun idea of both of them having been inspired by different readings of the same historical figure whose will they may both carry, which would make a Davy Back Fight between the two of them an especially noteworthy event. In chapter 1096, we were treated to the story of how the God Valley incident began, which essentially boiled down to Ginny summoning the Rocks Pirates by broadcasting the whereabouts of certain prizes, which attracted Rocks to the island, which attracted Roger to the island, and when Roger arrived, he stated, "It's been a whole year. Do you have any idea how I felt all this time?" And Scopogaban replies, "No special privileges for the captain here, Roger." So the whole crew is determined to confront the Rocks Pirates for some reason. That some reason may be Shaki at this stage. We don't know. But what we do know is that these two crews have had an encounter where Rocks got the better of Roger, which could have been an all-out clash like the Roger Pirates frequently had against the Whitebeard Pirates in later days, but they were much more friendly and more mentally on the same wavelength, whereas Rocks was not. He was a very agenda-driven individual, constantly on or in search of the pieces that he needed to bring his ambition to fruition. And to illustrate this point, Rocks didn't randomly stumble upon pirates and just decide to challenge them if he saw someone he kind of liked. He was a lot more precisely methodical than that. During the flashback in chapter 1155, we see Rocks holding a stack of bounty posters, and in a way, you could see Rocks as the world's most prolific bounty hunter, because what he did right, very clever, he let the world government do all of his research for him. And after the world government had deemed who the most threatening pirates on the planet were at any given point, Rocks would go out and try to recruit them, more often than not successfully via fun games. And if you look carefully in this chapter, you can even see the order in which it appears that Rocks recruited his first three crew members. You've got someone who appears to be Shiki at the top of his bounty stack in the first panel, with the next poster shown being Whitebeard, followed by Don Marlin, the gangster of West Blue, and the fourth bounty is unfortunately cut off, but it's either going to be one of Buckingham Stussy, Wang Zi, or Gunzui the Smuggler. But my greater point is that if Rocks came into conflict with Roger, it is because Mr. Rocks wanted something, and his established method for getting what he wanted was to commence a Davy Back Fight. But as explained to us in chapter 306, a Davy Back Fight is a contest for crew members. So if we went down this road, Rocks would have likely been searching for someone rather than something. Alternatively, Roger could have approached Rocks for a Davy Back Fight, searching for a someone, potentially a Shaki. But the traditional Davy Back Fight also comes with the option of stripping a crew of their Jolly Roger, which to many people who go through One Piece for the first time doesn't sound all that horrible, but symbolically this is far, far worse than having a crew member taken, as the way that Oda describes describes this act is to destroy the very spirit of the crew. And if I was to equate this to ship terminology, think of it as killing the clubauterman that inhabits the Going Merry. Yes, it would still be functional as a ship with its wood and stuff, but it would have lost the core spirit guiding it. But given that the Roger Pirates still exist in their current form at the time of God Valley, we would have no choice but to assume that if Roger did lose a Davy Back Fight to Rocks, then it was a crew member who was taken, or even multiple crew members depending on how many coin games were played. And the choices for who that could have been are quite wide-ranging. At the moment, the confirmed Roger Pirates that we see with the crew at God Valley are Roger, Rayleigh, Scopogaban, Millie Pine, UA Seagull, and Spencer. So everyone else is up for grabs. And it may even have been a member who did not return to the Roger Pirates out of some sort of reverence for Davy Jones, as the rules of the game do state that crew members 1 can only be regained through another Davy Back Fight, which sadly would not be possible with the alleged death of Rocks and the dissolution of his crew. But the other obvious question to ask is that if Roger didn't challenge Rocks, and Rocks wanted someone from Roger, why would Roger accept that challenge? What would Roger want in return, if that makes sense? And the answer to that could be potentially nothing. Currently, Luffy is following the path of Roger. He is retreading a lot of the same ground, quite literal ground, as well as hitting similar developmental character beats and working towards the same secret dream that he and Roger share. And in Luffy's case, he was tricked into accepting a Davy Back Fight. But also, Luffy was having the time of his life the whole way through. And Roger could have been the same. If Rocks really is more of a classical scallywaggical pirate, then he could have tricked Roger into participating, or Roger could have just done the Luffy thing of being wildly reckless, because at the time it sounded like the most fun thing to do. And in the end, what I'm hoping is that all of this comes back around in the modern day, and in the near future we see a scenario where the Straw Hats and the Blackbeard Pirates engage in the highest stakes Davy Back Fight that the world has ever seen to decide who will claim the One Piece.